Well, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's a very important show because the cascading default and also the, how should I say this, the destruction of the Earth's normal weather system is now playing out before everyone's eyes. And it's a privilege for me to be able to bring Dane on because Dane has a website that I go to always, geoengineeringwatch.org. It's really tough to get people to understand, Doug and Joe and listening audience, that this has been going on for some time. And when you use the term geoengineering, we're dealing with weather warfare, and it is the most widely used covert weapon of the power structure, and I believe it's going to lead to our destruction. I believe Dane does too. So, Dane, nice having you on. I just want you to basically take it from where you'd like to take this thing systematically. When you need a break, give it over to me or Doug. But this is one of the most critical issues. You know, I think it's important to, Dane, that people understand. When I started on talk radio 20-some years ago, 3-4 years ago, whatever it was, I started talking about chemtrails and basically weather wars and the weather modification on the planet, and people thought I was from another planet. You talk about not getting it or not wanting to get it, but tonight we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it in a scientific way, in a practical way, but I think that it's critical for people to recognize they are now reaping the whirlwind and the total devastation that is designed to be a weapon against them. Go ahead, Dane.
Steve, again, my gratitude back to you and to Joe and to Doug for giving us a voice, but you've been at this battle a very, very long time. You sowed the seeds that I'm perhaps trying to continue to work with my work that started in the early 2000s. But again, I know you've been at this battle a very long time, and people are finally, thankfully, beginning to understand the gravity of having Earth's life support systems completely derailed from top to bottom. And these programs are no less than that, as you correctly and accurately described, Steve. Weather warfare. Climate engineering can only be classified as weather warfare. The word engineering is far too dignified a term, although we are really most effective in this battle by using the science terms so that when people who are unfamiliar with this issue go to search online, they come to hard science. So it is a game of chess, if you will. Semantics are important, but if we stick to solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol geoengineering, climate engineering is a great term that people can understand. That's very clear. So anyway, it's all in that category. And the gravity of having the climate system, Earth's life support system, completely derailed and the entire planet contaminated, irreparably contaminated from the fallout, I would call that a fight for life, nothing less.
Well, and I think that it's critical. This is Dane, the most, how should I say, this is the frustration nexus that we all got to really grasp and understand. This is the destruction of life on the planet as we've known it. We'll get later into the show into what's happening with the plankton, the oceans, and everything else. But, you know, it started out with chemtrails, and people just couldn't believe it, even though I ran through patents, you know, over decades I ran through patents, and I'm sure, you know, from the HARP patent forward, the bottom line is there are so many geoengineering patents beyond HARP. HARP is 4686605. I remember trying to get a hold of Bernard Eastland, the patent holder, years ago, actually now almost a decade and a half ago, and for specific reasons tied to the Defense Department, I got to talk to him. I never got to interview him on the air. But the point that I think people have got to understand tonight, this is this is a crisis extinction level event that people look up in the sky, those who even bother to look up in the sky, but they don't get the ramifications. So tonight, I really want, you know, if you've ever listened to my interviews, I love to give the bottom line to people and then reinforce it through the show. So, you know, as you see it, the things, if I were to say, Dane, and I say this only, you know, in a metaphorical way, although with what's gone on today with cyber attacks, hacks, the whole world coming apart, if I had to say, give like the bottom line points and take them one by one, as you see they're the most relevant and most pertinent, and spell it out so easily. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be announcing what Dane's going to be putting on next month, Lord willing. But Dane, do that for us, would you? Because again, it's critical. I don't want people lost in, oh, it's just a chemtrail, guys, or oh, it's just this is real science. You are a solar engineer. You have noticed the decrease in solar energy, and it's affected the solar industry, but please give the most pertinent bottom line, because again, then we'll reinforce those points if you don't mind, because again, you are doing this on a daily basis, probably hourly basis, knowing you, and the thing is that people have got to get it. This is their life. This is not a scientific treatise on arguing the points of geoengineering. It's gone on. It's going on. You can read all the patents. The patents are more dire than the events that people really even begin to grasp. So will you do that, sir? And again, you take as much time as you need. When you need a break, give it back to whoever you want to give it back to, me, Doug, whatever, Joe. But please take it from there.
Steve, to fortify what you're saying, and for those that don't take this seriously, let me give a few facts and figures, then I'll get on to the event that we're planning in August or putting together right now. For starters, in the last 500 years, statistically, mathematically, Earth's biomass has declined by as much as 75%. That means 75% of the living organisms, living matter on our planet has disappeared in that 500 years. That's plankton, grasses, trees, everything alive. That's an incomprehensible reduction. In the last 40 years alone, statistically, human populations have doubled. Global wildlife populations have declined by nearly 60%. We're losing 200 to 300 species of plant, animal, and insect every single day. We're in the sixth great mass extinction right now, today. The species extinction rate is 10 to 15,000 times background rates. Statistically, that's a virtual free fall. So for those who don't take this seriously, they will soon. We have ecosystems collapsing around the globe right now. The crisis is not on the horizon. It's here now. So to the event in Redding, Northern California, August 14th, Friday night, we have John B. Wells coming to MC this event. We have a number of experts, former government biologists, former defense industry, presenting data that's not arguable. And this is conclusive film footage of these aircraft spraying at altitude. And we're talking about, we have film footage of military tankers, KC-10s, KC-135s, C-17 Globemasters, a new fleet of aircraft are being produced right now, KC-46As. They're adding to their tanker fleets. They're retrofitting older aircraft. They're putting as many aircraft in the air as they can. And this is, again, nothing more than an all-out assault. And it's important that people understand this, Steve and Joe and Doug. So many layers to this onion, and it's a mistake to try to put this in, and I know you know this, Steve, you've done a tremendous amount of research, but for many that are just looking into this, it's a mistake to try to put this issue into one or two categories. So many layers to this onion, and in addition to being able to manipulate populations and use of weather warfare, which has been going on for many decades, the droughting out of countries, bringing them to their knees, as we've seen in sub-Saharan Africa, countries that were droughted into a virtual state of emergency and then allowed U.S. occupation. That's why the U.S. has bases in 156 countries, some 700 bases plus. The Middle East, which was every single country in the Middle East which was destabilized, was subjected to record droughts prior to that destabilization. Now we see that happening in the western U.S. Is there something coming for us? It would seem very likely. We can get into this when you want with Jade Helm. But the bottom line, the use of these programs is many, many things, including an Arctic methane emergency, which is happening right now. And this is not about Al Gore or carbon credit shams or any of that. Gore's a criminal. He's a part of the cabal. He owns stock in the very companies he claims to be fighting. And we have some of these environmental groups like 350.org that is funded by the Rockefellers. I mean, I'm not talking about any of that type of hypocrisy. I'm talking about real on-the-ground emergencies that were in many ways triggered by the very climate engineering programs that we are told is mitigation for this. These programs have helped to cause the problem. They cannot help fix the problem. So they're trying to cover up, for example, the Arctic methane situation right now in the imploding Arctic sea ice. So just like the Corexit chemical, Steve, and Joe, and Doug, that you saw used in the Gulf of Mexico, where they used the Corexit chemical that made the situation 52 times more toxic, according to the environmental impact reports, they used it anyway because it helped to hide the problem. So geoengineering is used for a tool to introduce weather warfare, to use that type of manipulation, control the population's food supply, but it's also used to hide the gravity of the climate feedback mechanisms that are now unfolding, which climate engineering helped to trigger in the first place. Steve?
Well, I want to share with everybody on Dane's website, if you want to have all the documentation, I just commend you for this. I'm on your extensive list of patents. Dane, you put this together on August 8th, 2012. And ladies and gentlemen, go to geoengineeringwatch.org / an extensive list of patents. I'm looking in your, anyway, I'm just trying to find out a faster way for them to do it. But the point is, search this site. If you put in patents, will that bring up this page?
If you put in geoengineeringwatch.org patents, or even geoengineering patents, you'll come up with our page.
Okay, I want to give everybody just a feel for this. I don't know how many you have listed, but what is it? Somewhere about 50, 60 of them right in there. I want to give everyone a feel for this. In 1951, you think Dane is on a wild goose chase? Listen to this patent, okay? It's U.S. patent number 2550324A. And this is fascinating because a patent is process for controlling weather. Now, I'm only going to read some of the claims, and I've got a patent or two, and I know what you have to claim, you have to demonstrate. So here's the deal. This invention this is the sixth claim. This invention relates to a process for affecting changes in weather conditions, and more specifically to a process for dissipating clouds and fog by clearing the atmosphere of moisture particles that are large enough to be visible, yet not large enough to fall out of suspension in the gases of the atmosphere. The overall object of the present invention is directed to the control of weather conditions generally. And it says another object of this invention is the control of weather by dissipating typhoons, hurricanes, and other storm centers by the dissipation of convective clouds forming the weather phenomenon. So just as, Dane, you put up the process for controlling weather, I would say this. There is no human rational thinking or let's just say this hybrid that could deny this if they will just be honest enough just to read the claims of the patents. Now, all of this is directed at one thing, and I believe it is total control and the ultimate destruction of 6 billion people on the planet. I agree with Dane wholeheartedly. Someone says, do you believe in global warming? I say, I believe in global warfare being exhibited and manifesting against the world population. And when you see California, and Dane, you live in Shasta, in the vicinity of Mount Shasta, Shasta County?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so the point that I'm trying to make is, and Doug and Joe, I don't know if you guys have ever seen those patents, but I'd recommend, Doug, it might be cool just to link to that, because what we're talking about, and here's the thing, we're not talking about an emotional issue. We're not talking about, I don't think. Well, you don't think. That's the problem. You shouldn't say. You should never start any rebuttal with I don't think, because usually I'll follow that up with you don't know. So when you basically look at all of these things, you're going to see the fact when I'm talking these things being all of the patents that have been filed with U.S. Patent Office and are being acted on, there is no doubt. Now, Dane, when you present this type of evidence, and obviously we got 3 hours, so we can take our time, but when you present this evidence, it's beyond any emotional or, let's just say this, feel-good denial, is it not?
It's absolutely beyond. When you have film footage of the crime happening, and we do, that's the end of the argument. We have film footage of these tankers that I mentioned earlier spraying at altitude, up close, nozzles visible. Steve, I know you've seen this, and again, you're with your book, Weather Wars and Unnatural Disasters, you covered so much of this data, but we have so much more film footage now that's surfaced in recent years. I'll have a video out in the next 3 or 4 days that also shows up-close photographs of nozzles, retrofitted nozzles mounted on the pylons directly behind the jet engines in line with the engine exhaust so that it looks like, quote, condensation trail. We have up-close photographs of these nozzles on commercial aircraft, photographs from a distance also so you can see who that commercial carrier is. And this is in line with Project Cloverleaf, which is the use of commercial carriers for these programs, not with the commercial pilots and crew involved, but the aircraft are certainly being used. So as far as people arguing this, again, we have photographs of the nozzles, photographs of the plane spraying taking place. We have too many lab tests to even begin to go into. The same material named in these patents is showing up on the ground. And here's a final point that we should all consider. When you have the entire climate science community saying we must geoengineer immediately, and they are obviously completely criminal in their lack of disclosure in that regard, but we have the Obama administration, John Holder and his science advisor, all saying the same. We have the top U.S. military brass saying climate change, greatest national security threat of all, even though climate engineering has helped to bring us to this point. How can we possibly think they would not be engaged in these programs? And again, we have film footage of it happening. So denial is just that. It's denial. And those who deny these programs are simply burying their head in the sand, but their head's going to get ripped out soon, one way or the other. Steve.
That is what the bottom line is. Doug, go ahead. Are you there, Doug?
Yeah, sorry about that. What I was doing, Steve, I was actually putting up the link, direct link, on our website under the Listen Live on the right side.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't know that.
No, I wanted to get that up there because it's so important. What a list that is. And if people, the doubters out there, and Steve, I just want to interject something here. When I told a friend of mine what we're going to be talking about tonight, he looked at me and he says, "Well, you know, I find it hard to believe that this whole process of aerial spraying, for example, chemtrails, what people call chemtrails, if that was real, people would know about it." And you know, it took me aback but I remember being in that same position, thinking, "Oh, come on," you know, until I got your book, Weather Wars, and then started researching what Dane had done. I was, I mean, the lie is so big, isn't it? The lie is so big, and it's a massive lie conspiracy.
Well, it's the old statement, is it not, Dane, that don't confuse me with facts. My mind is made up to the contrary, or is it that? Do you think? And let me ask you this, because I'll go from the end time question or the end of the third hour question right now. Do you think that based on all your efforts and the amount of people that are finally getting it, do you think maybe there's too great an emotional toll to understand the ramification? Is that one of the reasons? I'm asking. I don't know, because it boggles my mind. If they can't lift up their eyes and see that the skies are being crisscrossed playing tic-tac-toe, or all the symbolism, or X marks the spot over targeted individuals, I think that there's something, the disconnect has to be so complete that when we get, let's say, 100 new people on a global scale, or however many people come to your website, I'm not talking that's how, millions have come to your website, but I mean that finally get it. What has been the single most astonishing, if you will, human habit of denial that you've encountered, and are you seeing it lessening? Obviously, that's what your efforts are trying to do.
Steve, you're exactly on target. This is simply a human defense mechanism. The notion that people are, for themselves, to face the fact that they're being sprayed and there's nowhere they can run from this, nowhere they can hide. And this is simply too overwhelming to their ability to cope in most cases. And it's a very primitive defense mechanism that forces people to ignore threats that they can perceive are on the horizon and not immediately in front of them, even though this threat is every bit as immediate as any other threat. But that is a primary defense mechanism for people to ignore this issue. And in regard to the level of the lie, which you spoke of a moment ago, and which Doug spoke of as well, the magnitude of this lie, of this quote-unquote covert program, which is really the largest elephant in the room, the whole condensation trail narrative is an absolute total lie. Almost without exception, we should not see condensation, quote, condensation trails behind any of these commercial aircraft and or military tankers. They all are fitted with high bypass turbofan jet engines. These engines are a jet-powered fan. 80 to 85% of the air that passes through these engines is non-combusted. By design, they are nearly incapable of making any condensation trail, and we have the film footage to prove even these short, bright trails are particulate dispersions. We have film of these trails being turned on and off. So again, we know the higher you go altitude-wise, the humidity drops prolifically. So we have very, very low atmospheric humidities, and they're getting lower. And this is a very profound fact. We see from the time we know these programs started in the late 40s, we see atmospheric RH, relative humidity, dropping. Now, how can that happen in a planet that's warming? And again, climate engineering has helped the planet to warm, not mitigated it. They can create cold events, and they do. They have. Boston last year was a big example of geoengineered cool downs done in the same region again and again and again. But it comes at the cost of a worsened overall warming. So back to the relative humidity. How can relative humidity decline on a warming planet? This violates the laws of physics. The atmosphere carries 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. We must have more relative humidity unless there's an element in the equation that is not being acknowledged. And that element is an atmosphere completely saturated with climate engineering, light reflecting, toxic metal desiccant materials, which are reducing the atmospheric relative humidity overall. So the bottom line is the elements in this equation relating to a, quote, condensation trail, every condition necessary to create a true condensation trail is not there. It's not there. The whole condensation trail narrative is a complete lie. These are sprayed particulate trails, not condensation, with almost no exceptions. And this is, again, the biggest lie ever perpetrated on the human race, is that we are seeing condensation trails in our skies.
Well, I agree with that. And here's the critical factor. When all of the globalists, Dane, the famous statement that the world needs a big enough threat to rally around in the global warming thing, I want to make it clear, ladies and gentlemen, the word ionospheric heater, which we'll get to when we deal with HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project, of which there are 72, by the way, and it's funny because I keep getting the same denialist, Dane, over and over saying, they closed HAARP down. No, they didn't. There's 72 of them worldwide, and they've even put them into the ocean now. The infamous barge with the giant sphere that people were wondering what was Google up to. All these things are right.
Those are SBX.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Steve. That's SBX radar that you're speaking about. If people want to Google and search that, they can find it. It's called SBX radar, the sea-based that you're talking about. Go ahead.
Right. And it's beyond RF stuff, too. I can remember talking to scientists and generals talking about, look, we don't just use RF, we use lasers now. And if anybody wants to question that, too, and we'll get to this state, here's the thing. Every single phenomenon that we are seeing associated with out-of-place weather patterns, with active volcanoes. You're talking about, obviously, the methane hydrate, all those things. In New Guinea, a number of years ago, the sea actually caught fire because of the methane, which was flammable, and they were talking about a tidal wave of flames. That was a pretty interesting story in Papua New Guinea. But given the fact that the world now is rallying around global warming, and you're even seeing the Pope, okay, I'm not a fan of that guy, okay, I want to make it clear. The thing is that it's astonishing to me that people are literally embracing the lie that is killing them, and it's not softly with his song. It is, and I'm talking about a song that was out there or something. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make, Dane, is that in laying out this as you do, and I want to go to your second point, and this is Dane's point, global climate engineering programs are contaminating every breath we take and the entire web of life. Every breath we take. Unfortunately, the liars that put this forth don't seem to be, going to their great reward underground quick enough. And, I mean, the point, I guess, is critical that they are contaminating everything. You know, the Air Force document, we own the weather in 2025, I said, well, that's a lie. They've owned it for the last 50 years. So in order to overcome normalcy bias, emotional shutdown, scientific jargonism, the lies flying out of the what I call paid whore scientific community, all of those things can only be overcome if a person really wants to seek the truth. Does it surprise you that in the whole, living in California, the whole California drought situation, and all the ramifications of the country, that people aren't screaming at the top of their lungs? You are. Now, don't get me wrong, and your August presentation is going to deal with that. But still, I mean, if I knew, and I do, so I'm screaming for 25 years, that these guys want us dead, they're actually what I call terror-forming, T-E-R-R-O-R, forming the earth, not terra, T-E-R-R-A, then obviously they are making it incompatible for human beings to exist. And I don't think it should be lost on no one that weather is a forced multiplier, and weather warfare, even in the military's terms, and also the fact that what you're seeing in your very area is so absolutely in your face, prima facie evidence that these guys are doing this. They're pulling it off, even when they're spraying their chemtrails off the ocean, allowing the winds to blow it in, the westerlies to bring it into the U.S. and up and down the West Coast, and yet people are having all the diseases and everything that they're encountering, and early death, the premature. So given all that, Dane, at this point, what, and here's the million-dollar question before we go wherever you want to go, what is it going to take, in your opinion, to bust this thing wide open, knowing that the mainstream media is nothing but the whore mouthpiece of the very people? Those are my words. Don't get mad at Dane. The whore mouthpiece of the very people that are openly, and I would guess this technologically, giving us a scientific middle finger as they kill the population on the planet.
First, in regard to your question of people waking up, and especially in California, given the fact that my presentations, like Engineered Drought Catastrophe Target California, going back almost 2 years, with a presentation that said this would happen. It couldn't not happen if these programs continued. Same data I presented to the Lieutenant Governor of California in the state capitol in his private office with his top 8. I presented this data to them in the Capitol, and there is absolutely no question. They know this is going on. About 9 weeks ago, 10 weeks ago in the Capitol, one of many trips I've made there, congressional reps told me to my face, quote, "We all know this is going on. We don't know what to do." While everybody's hiding in the corner, the Titanic is absolutely going down. And what will wake people up, Steve, to answer your question? Any one of a number of events that are coming will force them to wake up. When they turn on their spigots and nothing comes out, and we're near that point. Lake Shasta is in my backyard, the largest reservoir in California, and it's not much more than a mud puddle at this point. And they are aggressively making sure the rain does not reach us. Last night and tonight in Northern California, strong push of moisture, monsoonal moisture, and we can see them on the radar aerosolizing this moisture, blowing it apart before anything comes down. We had flash flood warnings last night for Shasta County. With a few exceptions, almost nothing came down. Same thing tonight. If you're outside, I live in a very remote area. It sounds like a parade of aircraft going over, like you're at the end of an international airport runway. They are aerosolizing that moisture. And what that means is this. When you introduce too many particulates, and they can spray, a large tanker can spray 60 to 70 tons of nanoparticulates. It's an inconceivable amount of material. That makes too many condensation nuclei. And as those condensation nuclei are scattered or repelled with radio frequency, it scatters the moisture. It keeps the droplets from combining and falling, so they can blow apart that moisture as long as they want. So bottom line is they have a noose around our neck. They control the flow of water. They control how toxic our air and water is. But when people can't get any water out of their faucet, that will force them to wake up. We're near that point. When we have a blue water event in the Arctic, and we are close to this, again, there's been a lot of disinformation, very, very coordinated disinformation as far as what's really happening in the Arctic. And right now, what the official informational sites like the National Snow and Ice Data Center, what they consider to be, quote, Arctic ice extent is anything with 15% of ice or more. Now, that still means 85% ocean, doesn't it? Is that really ice pack? I don't think so. And they never talk about the volume or the mass, which is really all that matters. And right now, in the next week, there's going to be profoundly warm temperatures in the Arctic. We had some places in the Arctic Circle at 97 degrees. Don't see a lot of headlines on that on mainstream media. So right now, just like they did in the Gulf of Mexico with the chemical Corexit, they're trying to hide severity of the problem and not disclosing issues. So in regard to the power structure and them hiding this, Steve and Doug and Joe, one more important thing to consider. As the climate system blows apart, and it is, and now the power structure, who I think some of which arrogantly thought they could control these systems, they're realizing they have torpedoed the ship, and the ship is going down. So we have leaders like Putin that I believe is actually rethinking his involvement with these programs, and certainly they're involved. There's a collaboration between the major powers on these programs, there's no question. So last September, when Putin requested the IPCC to address geoengineering, without that request, they wouldn't have addressed it at all. There was, it seemed at least for a short time, a warming up to the issue. I had, if you know who Abby Martin is on RT-TV, she was on RT. Abby became more communicative with me about this issue. It seemed Russia was starting to back off from their involvement. They wanted it talked about. So I think we're seeing a fraying of the power structures, a realization that these programs are sinking the ship on which they depend also. So I think it's going to be an interesting unfolding of events soon, Steve, Doug, and Joe.
We're at the point now where, again, cause and effect, you can't deny the effect, especially when you go to your drinking fountain or try to turn on your faucets and nothing comes out. But again, I think the thing that has to be understood, and I'm gonna just hit this over and over tonight, Dane. People have got to get it. The entire Earth's weather systems have been completely derailed, modified, engineered, messed up, screwed up, tweaked, torqued, meddled with. I'm running through my list of, and at this point there is no normal weather. Now, let's address, too, the ozone layer, because the ozone layer from the time of Project Argosy and some of the high-altitude experiments that went on that were in the 40s, and that's how long ago they were playing with this stuff, the ozone layer is being torn apart by climate engineering, and it's tattered. There's no end. And, if they take it out, there's no life on Earth. But, see, the argument is this. They will generate the problem, i.e., geoengineer it. They'll geoengineer the problem. They'll provide the solution. Oh, we've got to cut back on all of your, ability to make gas or bovine gaseousness or hydrocarbons. I'm sorry, there's a million of things they want to blame, but they all want to blame man. They're building a prima facie case that in order to make the planet happy, yippee-skippy, okay, you've got to take away the thing that's causing the very demise of the planet. It is such a twisted, inverted, perverse, disgusting logic and a twisting of the truth. But let's talk about the ozone layer. I don't think people get it, how important that is. And everything is that originally started in the global weather manipulation, you know this, it started with the ozone layer. They had to start messing with that.
Well, on ozone destruction, again, if we relate that from a broader perspective, as your book, again, Weather Wars and Natural Disasters, correctly alluded to, the use of the climate manipulation for the purpose of strategic advantage, bringing countries to their knees, as the climate system has been tampered with for so many decades, real damage has been done. And the blaming of the ozone destruction solely on CFCs was absolutely a red herring. I ask anybody to use their sense of logic. Is it more likely that aerosol spray cans are going to do that kind of damage, or thousands of tankers dumping particulates known to be very destructive to ozone day in, day out, 24/7 for decades? Which is the most likely cause of the ozone destruction? And if it was the CFCs, which were banned in the 80s, why do we now have massive northern hemisphere ozone destruction ozone holes right now that's not being disclosed if we ban these materials in the 80s. Again, part of the lie that a lot of things are blamed on issues that are not related in order to cover the tracks of climate engineering. When you put particulates in the atmosphere, it doesn't matter whether those particulates come from the back of an aircraft or from a volcano. Particulates in the atmosphere damage ozone, period. So we have the more they spray, the more they've used weather as a weapon, and that's the only way to describe this. There is no weather modification. It's not weather warfare. The two terms are synonymous. So the more they have tampered with the system, the greater the damage that's been done, and thus the more damage they do, the more they justify spraying to try to provide a shield, if you will, for the damage already done. Is this not the definition of insanity, to keep doing the same thing over and over and expect a different result? But again, there's nothing benevolent in these programs. It's about power and control. It's about DARPA weapons, ionizing the atmosphere for over-the-horizon radar, for EMP purposes, electromagnetic pulse purposes. So many layers to the onion, none of them for the common good, all of them destructive. And again, this is imperative that people understand in an overall context. If we stay on this course, near-term human extinction is a mathematical certainty. And I mean near-term to a degree that few are yet willing to comprehend, Steve. And I would like to ask Joe or Doug, how many of your listeners would you estimate, and I'm very curious about this, that have any real notion of or belief in the fact that on this trajectory we are very close to hitting the wall?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question, Dane. Honestly, I don't believe this topic, this issue, gets enough airplay, and I think that there's a intellectual disconnect because people don't want to believe this. So to answer your question, very simply, although we have the most educated audience in the world, I believe, the most informed audience in the world, I think on this issue, on this topic, not so much.
I have to ditto that too. Hey, Dane, just real quick. I have to ditto that because, again, when I talk about weather warfare, and I have for years, decades, they can't understand cause and effect. This isn't a put down. It's just an awareness issue. It's they cannot understand, and let's get into the oceans right now, because again, the plankton populations, they're plummeting globally. The marine ecosystems are crashing, and I said, and somebody took me to task, I said, pretty much Pacific Ocean is the Dead Sea, and they said, well, the Bible's, and I believe it's a prophetic fulfillment of the third of the life in the sea dying, but somebody said, well, it's only 30.3%, so Quayle's off his rocker, it's not really a third. Well, when you take in the frozen land mass that is also sitting on the body of water, guess what, it's an even third. They just came out last week, you probably saw it, and basically are admitting that now, scientists are admitting, there's something going on in the sea. Well, obviously we've got Fukushima contributing to that, but will you explain what aerial spraying does to the plankton? I mean, when you start kicking out the first, how should I say this, the most important thing on the food chain for the life in the ocean, it's not tough, is it, to figure out everything else dies from that point up? Go ahead.
Well, no plankton, no life on Earth either. So with that in mind, let's examine the ways that the climate engineering is decimating plankton populations. We have, again, the shredded ozone layer, which is unleashing profoundly intense UV radiation. We're measuring UV on the ground. I have expensive UV meters. And we're seeing, in the case of UVB, we're seeing levels 55 to 60%, 55 to 60% of the total UV. We're told it should be no more than 5%. So that means it's from 1,000 to 1,200% higher than we're being told. This is astronomically high. It's burning the bark off of trees. It's destroying tree foliage, and it's killing plankton. The plankton can't take this level of UV. So this is what we're told by major agencies like World Health Organization and some of the other meteorological organizations. We're told that no more than 5% of all incoming UV should be UVB. 95% or more should be UVA. There should be no UVC. And UVC is the last band of UV radiation before X-ray. So obviously the lethal nature of that should be clear. We're actually getting UVC on the surface now, and we're told it should stop 100,000 feet up in the atmosphere. So the bottom line is the intense UV is killing plankton. Also, this is especially applicable in the eastern Pacific off the U.S. West Coast. There is massively warm water there now. It's off the charts. So as the climate engineers have kept the, quote, ridiculously resilient ridge of high pressure parked over the west, which is absolutely a function of the ionosphere heaters and the aerosol spraying, they have caused ocean stratification. The ocean is stagnating. It's not mixing. And that warm water is building up, and that is also killing plankton, dropping the bottom out of the food chain. You can't interfere again with the systems, as you said, Steve, without derailing the whole system. The more damage they do, the more they ramp up the programs to try to mitigate it, which makes it worse still. So in regard to the plankton, from all those aspects, they are destroying plankton populations. And let's look at one more aspect, too, that you can talk about to any degree you want, Steve, or Joe or Doug. The Gulf of Mexico. Does anybody wonder why there are no hurricanes there since the oil spill? Nothing is allowed to spin there. They are absolutely suppressing cyclonic rotations in the Atlantic basin. In other words, they're stopping hurricanes. There's a sea of oil at the bottom of the Gulf. The Macondo well is certainly still leaking, and they don't want that churned up. But back to the plankton, again, when you stop the cyclonic rotations, you stop the mixing of the ocean in many aspects, you alter ocean currents, so it just becomes a larger and larger domino chain reaction of downstream consequences from everything they intervene with. So the ocean stratification, again, is a huge issue. The fact that they're suppressing hurricanes in the Atlantic basin to hide earlier crimes like the Gulf oil spill. This is just a massive game of atmospheric tug-of-war, weather whack-a-mole, and the more they intervene, the more they have to intervene to try to mitigate what damage they already did. So all these things are connected, but plankton stocks, the plankton populations, Steve, globally are down now about 50 to 60%, and plankton supplies over 50% of Earth's oxygen content, which is also plummeting right now. So again, from every angle, climate engineering is sucking the noose around our necks. Yours, Steve.
Well, I think that people need to understand, too, we've got coral reefs being destroyed all across the planet, and with what's called coral bleaching, we're seeing every single aspect of unique ecological communities in the ocean, on the land. We're seeing it all being destroyed. And Dane, let's get into what the compounds that they're spraying, barium, aluminum, all the different compounds that they're spraying, because I got an email tonight after we announced, or Doug announced tonight, linked to his announcement for the show tonight, that, has anybody ever tested the chemtrail resin? I'm not trying to make fun of that person, okay? But yes, it's been done so many times, and it's above a lethal dosage. It's above the EPA minimums. But would you take the time to run through in this section, I think we got another 14 minutes or so, just the barium, the aluminum, and all of the different contaminants and why they're using those specifically?
Yeah, happy to. We've done a tremendous amount of testing. In fact, I think as Doug said earlier that he initially had a hard time believing these programs were going on, as we all did. I certainly myself had to prove it to myself before I spent the last 12 years of my life dedicated to this issue. So in regard to the materials, when I first started to test for this, because I knew losing 60 to 70, 80% of my solar power uptake from my fully off-grid home from these aircraft trails, clearly something was going on. I researched the primary elements, being aluminum and barium, and there are other metals involved, which I'll go into in a minute. My first lab test here of 7 parts per billion of aluminum was already high, given my location. I'm not near industry, surrounded by forest. I should have, if anything, less than 1 ppb. I had 7. The preceding tests escalated as much as 50,000, nearly 50,000% in the case of aluminum, up to 3,450 parts per billion. We're talking about toxic rain. So we've seen so much of this metal fall on us that in Shasta County and Siskiyou counties, we have the USDA soil pH baselines down to the acre. These are very expensive studies. I have the original studies here and the original mapping. We've seen soil pH changes of 10 to 12 times toward alkaline. It takes an incomprehensible amount of metal to change soil pHs, and that's how much metal has fallen on us. And when we consider what internationally recognized geoengineer David Keith said on the record, and people can see what he said, by the way. If they Google David Keith, Dane Wigington, they'll see my confronting him at an international conference where he made quite some damning statements. His goal of 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates to be dispersed into the atmosphere annually, that's about 1,000 tanker loads a day, 24/7, 365 days a year, dumping into our atmosphere. It's an unbelievable amount of toxic material. So depending on what they spray, Steve, depending on the goal, whether it's to simply provide a canopy to disperse the moisture, there might be one particular mix involved with the spraying. We might see more aluminum barium. If we see chemical ice nucleation, and we see that a lot, and for those that don't know what that is, it means they can chemically nucleate and turn what should have been a rainstorm into a snowstorm. And those who don't understand ice physics might not understand how this could be done. If you Google engineered snowstorms, you will see some of our articles from Geoengineering Watch with lab tests showing you what happens when you put chemical ice nucleating agents into a beaker of water or biological nucleating agents. Either or will freeze the beaker instantaneously. There are very profound things going on. So depending on the application of the climate engineers, we might see different metals, Steve. We might see more lead and copper in the ice nucleated material as opposed to more aluminum and barium in the usual solar radiation management mix. So there's a lot of variations, but all these toxic metals are harmful. You mix them together, it's more harmful still. A very lethal brew. And so whether people want to face it or not or believe it or not, their health is being affected, every single one of them. Doug and Joe, I'm curious if with any of your vast audience, I know you have a huge audience, I'm curious if any of the escalation in Alzheimer's is being discussed, the incomprehensible escalation in autism, respiratory mortality. Are your listeners, do you think, aware of skyrocketing numbers in these various arenas?
I'd say, yeah. This is something that we've addressed from listener questions and from other, geoengineering subjects, is the heavy metal increase in the atmosphere and in the groundwater and in the soil, and it has been leading to crop failures. It's been leading to a whole host of different issues, health issues to agricultural issues.
And I got to tell you this: we personally, I know. I mean, I've got family members suffering from Alzheimer's. I've seen, I've got friends who are family members suffering from Alzheimer's, early onset dementia, and
increased rates of autism. Every 5 years you see a new figure. It's increasing to an all-time high in children.
I want names, Dane. This. Excuse me, but this pisses me off, and I'm sorry to say it that way, but if we're intentionally being poisoned, and what I see personally, on a personal level, our family members suffering from either autism or early onset of dementia or Alzheimer's, I want names. I want to know why this is happening. I want to know who's doing this, why they're doing it, what kind of psychos we have out there doing this, and and how in the world can they possibly justify this?
On that note, and I'm going to back into a couple other aspects of what you just went over, Doug, but I had a dialogue with one of the architects of these programs. I had through a congressional rep. The connection was made. I had one phone conversation and 2 email exchanges with an architect in these programs from Oak Ridge Labs. I published that, and your listeners can, if they search Dialogue with the Geoengineering Insider, they will see a transcript of that conversation. So to answer your question, what are they thinking? They think in bubbles, compartmentalized. They do not look at or do not consider the overall consequences. So this was his perspective. He felt that I think he said something that was paraphrased, if some trees had to die in California for what the power structure believed to be the overall good, then that was what had to happen. He had no comprehension of the ozone destruction, No comprehension of the fact that upper air currents are being altered, which is altering ocean currents. We now have warm water currents pumping right into the Arctic, thawing methane. And by the way, there's enough methane in the Arctic to create mathematically a Permian-style mass extinction 1,000 times over. There's enough to kill us all many, many times over. It's releasing now. If it continues, it's game over. He didn't see any of that. None of that was on his radar. He's simply in a compartment. So there are very few that understand the total ramifications. And those few, I would argue, are clinically insane. And that's not a metaphor. It's a statistical fact. 4% of the population is clinically psychopathic. So we have these people in power, and there's a common thread with that form of psychosis. There's a quote, and this is straight out of the psychological manuals. There's a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. So there's a massive blind spot with this sort of evil genius, and in their mind, if they perceive it to be for their good, to manipulate climate, bring countries to their knees, allow occupation. We're talking about individuals that are very, very fearful inside. That's why they behave in the way they do. They must have total control at any cost. And so that's why they do what they do. That's why they go to the South Seas and blow up pristine islands to test their nuclear weapons. There is no sanity here. And in regard to them doing this to themselves, it's a question a lot of people ask, why would they do this to themselves? I would bring up Fukushima. We have one facility that may kill us all, and yet we have 30 more nuclear power plants on the books right now. Obama recently authorized $6.5 billion for 2 more plants in Georgia. I mean, there's no end to this insanity. So the bottom line is weather warfare used as a tool of power and control, and now at this point, climate engineering is being used to try to mask the damage already done, to confuse the population in regard to that damage by engineering cool downs over and over like they did in Boston. They talked about the record snow in Boston, but did they talk about the fact that there was 0% snowpack in the Sierras? 0 by spring? Didn't talk about that. So again, a lot of layers to this onion, none of them in our favor. And again, if we continue on this road, it's game over, period.
Hey, Doug, what I would like to throw in is this. After 25 years, pretty much plus or minus, on talk radio, I only say that for perspective. I'm 64 next month, and so, that's a major part of my life, trying to get people to 40% of my life. But here's the thing. They're on record, and you know this too, Dane, all of the most powerful elite want the planet's population taken down to basically 500 million, the Georgia Guidestones, all of Prince Philip, Cousteau. I mean, you can just go on any internet search and type in mass extinction, but this is a manufactured. In essence, they want to kill off everybody, and you used the word. At the end of the day, whether they're psychopaths, whether they're just the greediest bastards in creation, and that word I use it in the context that they are, the idea is that they hate humanity. So while they think that they may exempt themselves, they are absolutely contributing, and I make no bones about this. This is why, and the words of Jesus when he said, if the days weren't shortened, there'd be no flesh left alive. These individuals are after global destruction of all life except them. Well, that's the ultimate control. And I was just, again, looking at all of the different things on your website. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that everybody's got to go back to the University of Geoengineering. And I'm serious about this. If I just look, and Dane, I'm still on the extensive list of patents, okay? I mean, if Veterans Health Department official speaks out on climate engineering dangers again. International known doctor addresses a dire climate engineering issue. Monsanto, and most people refer to them as Monsatan, chemical assault against the web of life. Shasta County update on heavy metal contamination, the legal ramifications. Mysterious extreme warmings of the ocean baffle scientists. It shouldn't baffle anybody. Do you remember, Dane, seeing the plan to actually melt the Arctic in order to be able to access the resources up there, primarily oil? Do you remember seeing that plan? I mean, you can go on and type it in. It's a plan to melt the Arctic. Would you suggest, or would you say, Dane, that's going on right now?
this is where the equation again becomes more complex. And as far as the desire by those at the top to cull populations, they've talked about it on the record, so there's no denying that is on their agenda. It's important for us to remember the vast majority of military people, good men and women in the military that are there for honorable reasons, are not being told the truth. They're being told what they're participating in with these aerosol operations is for the common good. We need to reach them so they wake up and realize this is not for the common good. In regard to the Arctic and melting the ice cap, that was discussed at one point in time with a very small arena of people. But this is what's important to remember. I watch daily and have for over a decade the ice extent charts and their correlation with increased aerosol operations. There is no question that whatever their intent may have been at one point in time to access Arctic resources, once the true magnitude of the methane factor became apparent, they have been frantically trying to retain the Arctic ice, but paradoxically in a manner that's making the situation worse, not better. So the ice pack really started to crash in 2007. We saw a massive polar ramp-up of the aerosol operations. And miraculously, because they can chemically ice nucleate, they can divert moisture and ice nucleate to build up some of the ice pack, the overall ice extent increased in 2008 and 2009 to a degree that had the entire climate science community scratching their heads, and it was a direct correlation with the ramp-up in climate engineering. Now, granted, the overall effect planetarily is a worsened warming, not better. You don't get something for nothing with nature. So we saw again in 2012, we saw a near crashing of the ice pack, and we saw yet again another ramp-up. And here's a very important correlation. I've watched this for a decade. The ridiculously resilient ridge over the U.S. West, which has really been most in place since 2007, that is part of how they trap some of the warmer air in the Arctic to try to sustain the ice extent. Now, up till June, up till the end of May, the Arctic ice was at all-time record low. Then it was in a very downward trajectory. They put massive high pressure over the U.S. West. Anybody who's watched the weather over the course of June, we have virtually fried in the West. Temperatures in the 1-teens. In Northern California, 85-degree nighttime lows. We have absolutely fried. And immediately, the downward trajectory in ice goes back up. They're able to trap some of the cold air in the north and try to retain this ice. But it comes at the cost of a worsened overall situation. That's where their short-sightedness comes in. To try to shorten the story, yes, Steve, I do believe they discussed, and I know they discussed historically, it's a fact, the attempt to melt the Arctic to reach the resources, but since the methane issue became so apparent, they have frantically tried to go the other direction. And it's important for people to understand this, because for those in the climate science community and those in the military that are engaged with these programs, if the official narrative from us in the alternative news community is that we think that they're intentionally trying to melt that, which again was discussed at one point but not the case now, we will lose those people. We will lose those that we need to build bridges with. And though that was, again, discussed at one time, the current scenarios based over the last decade of constantly watching these charts does not support that that's an agenda item now. But as far as everything else you mentioned, the population reduction intent for those in power, eugenics, that can't be argued. It simply can't be. The Agenda 121 issue, I mean, all of that must be considered a part of this equation. But it's complex, and we have to be careful to look at all aspects.
Well, Doug, do we need to take a break? Because when we come back, I'm going to suggest, Dane, to you that I'm not if you're familiar or not, but we'll talk about Borisov, the Russian scientist's idea to melt the Arctic ice cap, and why I believe that's underway with Russia's building of the massive military installations in the Arctic. So, Doug, should we take a break and then we'll get into this? Because, again, this is to enhance what Dane is already saying, and with this comes all of the attendant methane issues. Well, there's one of the questions I proposed, Doug, and I proposed, Dane, and this really is now what I think is happening. all of our secretaries of defense have always alluded, Defense Secretary Cohen, Sam Cohen, Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor. If you start looking up on weather warfare quotes, you'll come to the knowledge that these guys know perfectly well they're generating weather wars against each other. But I want to draw attention, Dane, and then get your feedback. Listen to this. This is what's interesting about writing books and doing the research and stuff. The idea of melting the Arctic ice cap actually was proposed by a Harvard geologist, Nathaniel Shaler, in 1877. He proposed channeling, I'm reading this now, more of the warm Kuroshio current through the Bering Strait. But now jumping forward, okay, this is amazing to me. Well, Julian Huxley, and by the way, he's one of the leading opponents of the New World Order, Julian Huxley. Well, he was the head of the United Nations, UNESCO, proposed in 1946 to use nuclear weapons to break up the Arctic ice cap. But going back to Borisov, okay, Peter Mikhailovich Borisov basically made this statement. He said they see no negative benefits to melting the ice caps, and he asserted that melting of the Greenland ice cap would raise sea levels only 1.5 to 2 millimeters per year. But the idea was, listen to this, he wanted to increase the rainfall worldwide. Now, obviously, he wasn't familiar at that point with all the geoengineering that's taking place. Now, here's my statement. With the Russians moving massive amounts of military into the Arctic, claiming new Arctic reserves, and claiming, that so much of the Arctic is now theirs, with the idea of being able to melt the, if you will, the polar ice cap, they see nothing wrong with it, and I maintain that's going to be underway right now. So given the fact that the Russians see no harm in it, but given the fact that they are using weather weapons, their Tesla physics and everything else going on, what have you ever postulated, Dane, as to what would happen when everybody begins weather warfare against each other using chemicals, using RFID, HARP-type devices, antenna arrays, and also lasers? I mean, have you ever just sat and gone, good night, these guys are going to parallel each other at some point. They're going to create a super potential type massive, if you will, reflection and deflection, all of this stuff, and it's going to be total mayhem. Were you familiar that the Russians actually, at this point, believe that they can take down the Arctic and, melt the ice, and it will be beneficial?
Well, there were points in time when and Nathaniel Shaler in 1877 did discuss this, and a lot of points along the way. In 1929, Herman Oberth, Huxley in 1945, a lot of discussion of this. But as the ramifications were more thoroughly understood and realized, in fact, here's from a major article on this issue right now. In 1962, geoengineering efforts to warm the Arctic were widely entertained. But in 1966, it was a top priority to prevent the Arctic from warming by even 1 degree because the full ramifications had been realized. So if we look at global mean temperatures, we see, and this is information is available to anybody if you search this online, we see in the late 40s, when we know these programs were ramped up the most significantly initially, we see a leveling off of what was a linear rise in global temperatures. And we see this continue right about to the early 70s. And this leveling off of temperatures was very perplexing to the climate science community, who did not know climate engineering was going on, or at least were not acknowledging it. So you had about 20% of the climate science community in the early 70s, I'm sure you might remember this, Steve, that they felt perhaps another ice age was coming on. They had no idea what could have caused this leveling off of temperatures because they did not know there was heavy geoengineering going on over the polar caps at that time. And a document that if your listeners, Doug and Joe, search 1966 document geoengineering, I found this on the NASA archives in 2012. It's an 80-page document from the Executive Office of the President listing the scope and scale of the U.S. weather mod programs as of that time, budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And these are the agencies listed on the document that were involved. And this is an 80-page document: DOD, DOE, Department of Commerce, Department of Health, Education and Welfare, Department of the Interior, Department of the State, Federal Aviation Agency, Council on Economic Advisors, Atomic Energy Commission, National Science Foundation, NASA, Department of Agriculture, Bureau of the Budget, Arms Control. It goes on. Universities, UC California, LA, Institute for Advanced Studies, MIT, University of Wisconsin, UC California, Livermore, Colorado State, University of Minnesota, Woods Hole Institute. It goes on and on and on. There are so many people involved with these programs. It is absolutely mind-boggling the level of lying and deception going on right now. All this going back to the Arctic again, back to your original question, Steve. Yes, there was a lot of dialogue about this, but that dialogue really came to an end in the official circle where it mattered in the late 60s when the full ramifications were realized. And in regard to sea level rise, it's rising exponentially faster now than the models in previous years showed. This has been publicized on peer-reviewed study recently. We're in much worse shape than people imagine already. Miami's pumping out every high tide right now. It's rising exponentially quickly. Right now, mathematically, there was probably 80 to 100 feet of sea level rise baked into the system if you stopped all industrial activity right now and all climate engineering right now. So, again, the paradox is this. Though we are being sold that climate engineering is a mitigation tool, all the data indicates climate engineering is fueling the fire, period. They can create cool-down events at the cost of a worsened overall warming. In regard to sea level rise, there's 21 to 24 feet of global sea level rise in Greenland alone. There's 197 feet of sea level rise in Antarctica. The rest of the year's glacier is about 15 feet, about 230 to 240 feet overall. So we are on that trajectory now, and the ramifications are going to be hard to hide for much longer. And one thing I want to point out, Steve, and I'm sure this will fit into everything we've discussed. Yes, they can create cool downs, which come at the cost of worsened warming, but they can and are also creating warm events. As I just mentioned over California, the ridiculously resilient ridge, we absolutely see higher UV radiation levels and higher heat when they are spraying a particular type of application that makes the skies silvery white. You don't see the horizon trails, you just see a silvery white sky, shorter bright trails, but absolutely spray. And people should notice the sky is silvery white. It's very easy to see. If you block the sun with your hand, you can see the big halo around the sun. It's becoming very common, and we see astoundingly hot temperatures underneath this application. It's almost a lens effect, and we positively see higher UV readings under this application of geoengineering. What does this mean? It means they are actually intentionally causing heat. Under many applications, we feel, in order to increase the strength of the high pressure in order to steer the jet stream. So again, it's one layer of destruction on top of another, on top of another. And yes, you have disaster capitalists trying to access the resources in the Arctic. Absolutely, don't argue with that. I would simply state that I believe for some time the power structure has realized that to thaw the Arctic intentionally would be an absolute death sentence for all life on Earth. And they have since been in damage control, but the damage control is making it worse, not better.
Well, I absolutely concur with that, and you know, from the people when we do shows like this, Dane, Doug, and Joe, I'll get emails from Miami, and it's true the sea level is rising, but again, with atmospheric lenses. And, you know, maybe we don't get into the laser weather modification tonight, but here's the deal. The lenses act as just as you're burning paper, and this is something that people have got to understand. Did we not, Dane, just see some world record temperatures set in India? Maybe not as an ultimate high temperature, but a sustained temperature, India, Pakistan. I live in Montana, in Bozeman, Montana, and I just talked to a guy that I ran into a restaurant the other night who used to own a restaurant. And he said, Steve, I was up in the Flathead 3 weeks ago, and some of the water was 70 degrees. Now, Flathead Lake is big, and Flathead Lake is cool. But interestingly enough, that's the area of Glacier National Park. talking to a friend of mine who's a helicopter pilot who flies me when I go up there to take aerial pictures. He said, man, it is so hot. Everything is premature. So your point is being taken, and that's basically right on the Canadian border, Dane, between Montana and Canada. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the cooking, that we've always heard that of cooking the books. Well, at this point, I think it's time for the goose and the geese who are having their what's cooked to basically recognize this is not normal. So I'm saying it's like these guys. They create a disease. Okay, then they provide the solution, but the solution kills you quietly over time, but you have to pay them to be able to keep you alive during the time they're killing you. And this is the whole argument, this is the whole meaning behind geoengineering, in my opinion, okay, based on all the facts, based on all the testimony, based on all the statements, based on all the interviews. They exactly know what they're doing, and I believe in the unintended consequences being thrown into the equation. But at the end of the day, nothing gets more people killed faster than pretty much famine and disease. And when you've got famine, then obviously disease follows. So with what's going on in California, I'm getting back to my original question. I wish people could understand how important it is. The Central Valley in California is considered the the salad bowl, and obviously people who drink wine and like California wine, they're in for a real surprise. But the economic component of weather warfare, and this is what's happened. You started the first hour interview by saying, that our government makes weather warfare against other governments and other nations. Well, the people who now have the ability, primarily Russia and China, to challenge the United States in that realm are also spending horrific amounts of money against the United States in counterforce. And that doesn't even take into the ability, some of these patents talk about generating earthquakes and generating volcanoes. We've got, 50 to 70 volcanoes going off right now that have been dormant, many for thousands of years, most for hundreds of years, and that's within the same parameter of so many of the patents for earthquake generation and volcanism. So when volcanoes go off, obviously, let's talk about the ocean acidification going on, and also the sulfur dioxide that goes into the upper atmosphere. It's kind of, I would say this, it's a composite kiss of death. Let's deal with the acidification of the ocean and what that means, because again, at the end of this show, my prayer is that enough people will wake up to say, man, I got to look into this. This is way beyond just seeing patterns in the skies of jets flying, making tic-tac-toe or pentagrams or Masonic. Somebody sent me an email tonight of a Masonic, what's it called? Two inverted V's. I can't even think of it right now. But the point being is, thank you. The point being that this stuff is going on. So, Dane, please address the ocean acidification, and let's just be blunt, okay? California is under weather warfare. Texas has been under weather warfare for 10 years. You know who fights me the most on that? The guys that are basically losing their cattle in Texas. It's happening. So let's talk about ocean acidification. Then let's talk about the fires now that are taking place all over the world. Because, listen, these guys they are planning a poisoned earth and a scorched earth policy simultaneously. Go ahead.
First of all, I want to make clear, I completely agree with you on the fact that those at the top are wreaking destruction for purposes of power and control. And in that sense, yes, they know exactly what they're doing, and this is the intent, to force populations into disruption, destabilization. It's what they've done in the Middle East. So I'm not arguing that intent at all. What I'm saying in regard to the overall ramifications of the climate engineering, I think they've bitten off much more than they can chew, and that's starting to sink in. The consequences of what they've done is starting to become apparent, and I think it's causing a fraying in the power structure now that is certainly in our favor. The more they infight, the better. The attack on California, there's no question. There's absolutely no question. Their consistency with dispersing the rain here is absolutely inarguable. They have made sure that the precipitation is radically reduced here. In regard to the global temperatures, and this is important to understand, when you see a record, you can probably add 4 or 5 degrees to that record. We have checked and compared the official high temperature readings with the actual readings on the ground in numerous locations, and we are seeing, one of my friends with the Union of Concerned Scientists help with this effort, we're seeing, in his case, a 4.6 degree under-reporting of the temperatures. What does that mean? It means it's much hotter than we're already being told. In regard to the ocean acidification, and that's happening at a radical rate, it's 30% more acidic than it has been historically. We are already seeing marine ecosystem collapse. Let's go back to geoengineering, another aspect of geoengineering, ocean fertilization. And I've done articles on this because I believe it's already going on, where they are combining solar radiation management and ocean fertilization by using materials that they spray in the troposphere to block sunlight. This is marine layer enhancement, one of the solar radiation management tactics. And when those materials fall to the sea surface, they are intended to cause ocean fertilization, plankton blooms, which further acidifies the ocean. This is where, again, the folly of geoengineering, and ocean fertilization is a form of geoengineering to attempt to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and put it in the ocean. Well, if the oceans die, we die. And this is yet one more tunnel vision approach to a problem that does nothing but harm. So how are the global fish populations right now? Global pelagic fish populations down 95%. How much longer can we catch and eat fish out of the oceans? The marine ecosystems are virtually collapsing. In regards to the CO2 situation, and it's important that all of us look at this equation, not just of this or that, but it's multi-layered. So in the case of CO2, is CO2 necessary? Yes. Is too much a problem? Yes. And we're putting 100 million tons a day into the atmosphere, 36 billion plus tons a year. That is absolutely a problem. And although CO2 is necessary for plants, I would challenge people to search the fact that too much CO2 stunts plant growth. Too much heat also stunts all growth. In fact, photosynthesis does not take place at temperatures over 104 degrees. That's it. It's done. So there's so many ramifications. Again, water is necessary for life, but if we're 10 feet underwater, we're not going to live long. So a lot of aspects to all this. But your main point, Steve, do those at the top understand the decimation they are causing? Is that their intent to control populations, destabilize, cut off food supplies? Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you wholeheartedly. So we're talking about weather as a weapon. Doug and Joe, on that particular point that Steve made, which again I wholeheartedly agree with, for your listeners, the notion that the U.S. government would be using weather as a weapon to further control their own populations, what percentage of your listeners do you think could, if they looked at the data, accept that reality?
Every listener who is intellectually honest, and I believe the vast number of listeners could accept the data if presented to them in an understandable format, the same way I could. You know, I had to come to this realization where I'm at right now, not by somebody saying, well, this is what's going on, but by intellectual discourse, like talking with Steve Quayle and talking with people like yourself and having you and Steve say, look, here is the evidence. And to answer your question, presenting the evidence, presenting the documentation, I think anyone with any degree of intellectual honesty would certainly embrace and accept that. So I hopefully that kind of a long answer to a yes or a simple question, I suppose.
If I could pose just a couple examples, and then I want to hear Steve's take on this. But if our population, let's look at the nuclear detonations our government did. And they had our own soldiers stand out in these fields with a set of goggles on as if that would protect them and expose them to nuclear detonations. Let's look at Agent Orange. do we really think that our government didn't know our troops on the ground were being irreparably poisoned along with populations? Let's look at depleted uranium, the ammunition our own Army uses that caused perhaps 200,000 injuries with our troops, Gulf War syndrome. And I know a lot about this. I paid to have a Marine veteran speak on this issue in Northern California because I felt people needed to hear. All those people who drive around with a little sticker on their bumper saying support the troops that never did a damn thing to support the troops. I brought him here. I paid for several hundred commercial tapes on depleted uranium to try to help this community understand our own government doesn't give a damn about our own troops. That's another example. Let's look at 9/11, the first responders who were told it was safe to go back into that emergency site, and now they all have cancer. They absolutely knew that it was not safe. We have example after example of our own government, and this is historical fact, doing biological testing. Steve, I know you know a lot about this, so maybe you can follow me up in 1 second here. We have how many examples? About 24 historical examples of our government doing biological experimentation on innocent U.S. civilians. Steve? We still have Steve?
Yeah, we do.
Can you hear me now? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Every government program, every military program always has the EF in it. And the EF is the experimental factor. Every vaccine developed for the military is a beta test. Every single thing they do is our servicemen. This is my chief bitch, okay? And people get mad at me for talking like that. Well, they better start waking up, because the idea that American citizens and everybody listening to us tonight is in effect a caged guinea pig. And or how do I say this? An experimental lab entity undergoing the experiments even as we talk. So there is number one, there is no truth. Number two, there is no concern, care, compassion. And by the way, the one thing, Dane, you probably know this, Doug, Joe, I hope you do. Do you know what the number one enemy is to the U.S. military and their super soldier program? Do you guys want to guess?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know.
Compassion. They want a completely... No, seriously. Aren't we seeing brain chemistry studies going where they want to read our mind, they want to control our mind? Well, tonight what Dane is presenting, ladies and gentlemen, is probably, in my opinion, the finest systematic approach to the entire concept of geoengineering. The idea is that if you take the time to go on his website, if you take the time, you don't have to read all those patents. Read the first 3 or 4 claims or the first 4 paragraphs. You'll get the feel for it. The idea that Dane has put forth is, Dane, I want to address this because I think what you're planning on doing in August, take a little time. This isn't a pitch. It is a reality check. And for those of you that really want to basically address this in your states, you need to come to this because there are some people Dane can't announce who are going to be there. I don't know them by name, but I know them by their positions. And he's put together, is this a fair statement? This is going to be your opus magnum in presenting to the world the most complete and concise information-packed, couple days that you've done. I mean, of everything you've done, you're making this the nexus point, are you not? Now take the time to share kind of what you envision for it, and then tell the people how they sign up or where they go. This is critical. Now I'm going to be putting, ladies and gentlemen, on Doug will too, we'll be putting up on our websites all the contact information, but I said to Dane, and I stand by, I said, Dane, I want to give you $1,000 to basically help this out. I wish I could write you a check for 7 figures. I say that because that, in my opinion, this whole idea of geoengineering, weather wars, and an extinction-level manifestation at the hand of some very evil, and I don't even consider them human beings anymore, and I don't, okay, I call them entities, is the critical point for all of us. In other words, everything else, finances are melting down, everything that's going on, the birds abandoning Florida. I mean, the sharks coming into the waters. I have another take on that also, just for people's information. The sharks have a lateral line system. That's how they sense a fish in distress. I used to be a big-time diver. I worked on shark repellent. I did a lot of stuff with people in that realm. So the point being is that we're seeing now the most critical point. And Dane, in my opinion, the project that you're doing in Northern California is, I would say this, the sentinel point of absolutely presenting reality to a people who have intentionally, and when I'm saying this, forgive me, unintentionally been dumbed down by the chemicals in the chemtrail spraying. So explain exactly what your conference is going to be, how long you see it happening, and don't name names because, people are ending up getting terminated and murdered now. But, the point being is that, and ladies and gentlemen, pray for this conference. The point being is that it's truth. And we do have the ability to present the truth. Now, whether people choose to believe the truth or not, that's a whole different story. But take the time and explain. Cover it in detail until you feel that you've exhausted what's going to be taking place, or get everything off your heart, because this is critical. This is where the activist phase, the last thing we want, Dane, tonight, Doug, Joe, is people to say, well, isn't that interesting, and do nothing? Or isn't that interesting and say nothing? Or isn't that yawn, go get the TV remote and click on some, I won't say the word, some dumb donkey show, that simply entertains them, destroys their critical thinking, and fills their mind with trash where they can no longer critical think. So go ahead, Dane. Take your time. Spell it out. Tell people where they register, how they register, etc., if you would, sir.
Thank you, Steve. Quite simply, we are at an apex in human existence right now. The purpose of this gathering in Reading on August 14th, and we will accomplish this in one evening. People are coming from a considerable distance, is to present irrefutable data to make clear to those that attend that based on all available data, it is a mathematical certainty that if we do not deal with this issue, we will soon have nothing left to care about, period. This is the battle for life that must be addressed. There'll be a very significant amount of materials there passed out for free to those that attend, commercial DVDs, color glossy two-sided informational flyers, tools that people can use to help us reach critical mass. And that is the main primary purpose of this meeting, to drive home the urgency and the immediacy of this issue, to have experts there that can make that point clear. Again, former USDA biologist, Forest Service biologist, Fish and Game biologist, former defense industry. I will be doing the most gloves-off, up-to-date PowerPoint that I've ever given, and we will absolutely provide the data necessary. And on the DVDs that will be handed out, there's about 4 presentations on that DVD, and they can be copied and passed out. There's nothing commercial about any of this. We're simply fighting for life, and that's my mission in life. I live for the day, Steve and Doug and Joe, to see this insanity in our skies exposed and halted so that life can, again, try to resume, try to sustain itself. So the point we're driving home, as you correctly said, Steve, we are all lab test subjects in the largest and most lethal experiment ever carried out by the power structure, an experiment that is deciding all of our fate by the day. If you care about your children, if you care about any future at all for them, please try to attend the event. And again, there is no entrance fee. There's nothing commercial about any of this. I've supported myself off my SEP IRA account for the last 10 years because the paradigm we're heading into, it's not going to matter. And that's what people need to realize. The paradigm we've all been told will happen, as Steve has already said a number of times through this broadcast, it's not going to happen. The golf game in 10 or 20 years is not going to happen. If that's what you're looking for retiring, I would argue you should put your efforts toward trying to salvage some sort of future for your children now, today. This is where we find out native. Okay, so this is bottom line. We're all, whether we believe it or not is irrelevant. We have the lab test to prove it. We are all test animals at this point. If you care about any future, please help us sound the alarm. This event is the attempt to really get that out. It'll be professionally filmed. We need to pack the House. That will get us the mainstream media coverage we need. There'll be a representative from our attorneys team there. We have 6 U.S. attorneys, 2 Canadian. We're trying desperately to get this on the radar. And Steve, as you also said correctly, that those who speak out get the hammer lowered on them. And this is absolutely the case. I've been contacted with scientists from major universities a number of times who tried to share data and were immediately shut down, taken off the radar. One, I was told from a major university that she had been taken into a room twice and told, if you talk about this anymore, there'll be consequences. The power structure is making scientists cower in the corner while the entire ship goes down. And we need the public to be involved in order for us to reach critical mass so that all those people in academia can come out of the shadows because they know this is going on. I've spoken to NOAA scientists face to face who told me, and I quote, we know this is going on. We're alarmed as hell. Just like the congressional reps, they said, we don't know what to do. The public must become involved. That's the purpose of this event, Steve, and I'm so grateful for your support, so grateful for Doug and Joe's willingness to air this out. So, again, my gratitude to all of you.
No problem. We will, and as Steve said, we will be posting on our website, Steve, as well, all information for this event. And Dane, I was talking to Ken earlier, and certainly we'll have you back on to nearer the event to remind everyone. But let me slip in a question here, if I may here. Just real simple, logical question, and perhaps this might be academic to most or some. But how do the powers that are behind this evil agenda, how do they expect? I mean, do they believe they're not? They're somehow exempt from the fallout of what's taking place, or how are? For example, you had mentioned about the increase in Alzheimer's and autism. How do they get around that? What do they breathe separate air than we do? Do they eat separate foods? Do they drink separate water? What's the deal?
I would answer that question in a number of ways. First, we know they have methods of chelation that are not available to the general public. I've communicated with the Norwegian researcher that has been into this facility a number of times. The blood is pulled from the body. You're on a table for 2 days, and the entire system is cleansed. And again, this is a very expensive, exclusive method of chelation that is not available to the general public. That's one way in which they could exempt themselves from the temporary impacts of these programs. On the larger picture, again, we know they're digging in. The deep underground military bases, there's no speculation on this. We have photographs of the entrances. I've done presentations on this. The tunnel boring machines called moles. Some of these are 50 feet high. They are burrowing like moles all over the country, digging in. We spoke to Mountain House Freeze-Dried Foods. It was 3 years ago, some of their management, when Mountain House went offline for a long time, off retail, because they were stocking up military bunkers. So do the global elite think they're going to go underground and ride this out? Some of them do. But let me point out that we know from paleo data, from past mass extinctions, and we are in the 6th great mass extinction now. Again, I want to remind your listeners of that. That's a statistical fact. And during previous past extinctions, like the Pedum event, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum 55 million years ago, we had about a 10 to 20 million year equilibrium period afterward. Can they stay underground that long? Of course not. Is that apparent to them? It doesn't seem to be, or at least they're still heading that direction. But I believe this, again, I do believe that although they are actively using these tools of nature as a weapon on populations around the globe, I do believe that more and more of the power structure, even at the top, is realizing that on this trajectory, they die with us. And as they realize that, I think we'll see a fracturing in the power structure. I think we'll see more and more military people waking up to this issue. I had a call about 2 weeks ago, out of the blue, from a U.S. Air Force general. Now, you don't get calls like that often. And to know that he was awake to this issue, following Geoengineering Watch, clear on the severity of what was happening, sharing it with his other colleagues that are also high-ranking officers, that was certainly a lot of wind in my sails, because the only way we can stop these programs, our only chance, is to reach enough critical awareness, back to the event in August, back to how critical that event is, to absolutely pack that house. That auditorium, by the way, seats well over 1,000. Again, there is no entrance fee. I simply need people to show up and help, to physically help with sharing the word, to getting the word out. That's what I need. So back to that critical mass of awareness. It's reaching that awareness that allows people like the general who called me to become awake, that then allows him to start to share that information with other military generals, so that we can break the machine down from the inside out, so that we can get the U.S. military, at least enough of them, our brothers and sisters who don't realize what they're doing, to join us in the fight against this insanity. All this is connected.
Thank you, Dane.
Well, I think, too, that people need to understand something. This goes back, Dane. Do you guys remember, Doug, Joe, and Dane, when the first zombie fascination started to be put forth into the public eye? It was about pretty close to, I think, 7 or 8 years ago where it really came on the scene. Now, I'm not talking about, the very first zombie movies that were out in Hollywood, in the late 60s, early 70s. But I think it's critical for people to understand that there is an attitude in the elite that everybody above ground is a zombie. By making everybody above ground after whatever conflagration that they imagine, whether it's biological, think of all the movies you've ever seen or heard or read about or watched on YouTube, or any of the video games, there's always a cataclysm involved. Out of that cataclysm comes a mutagenic species or an alien species that basically has a lust for human flesh, and we've seen it's the guys with the guns against the zombies who, if you get caught by a zombie or get bit, you get the virus and turn into a zombie. Well, what was going on through that whole thing was a psychological conditioning of the American public that there is a group that will survive, obviously the elite. And while they don't show them in deep underground military bunkers, some do, forgive me, but the majority of them usually are running for their lives in the woods, or finding an old abandoned warehouse, or finding a mall, getting on top of the roof and blocking the entrances into a mall. Okay, that's kind of a quick and dirty, and when I say quick and dirty, I don't mean obscene, I just mean overview of the zombie protocol. When the late Sue Bradley was alive, she did the most wonderful and extensive research on zombies. And it's on my website, stevequayle.com. It's in the upper top right-hand corner. But what's critical about this, Dane, what's critical about this, Doug and Joe, is the fact that it is the vilification of everybody above ground after an event. Now, Dane, you deal primarily with geoengineering, all the ramifications, the climatological, but the psychological vilification of people. It therefore gives the elite, if you are basically nullified, you're a zombie. You may not be eating human flesh, dragging your only good leg around with blood and gore all over you and, your insides on your outside. But what that was the presentation by the elite and to the elite that everyone above ground is zombies. Does that make sense to you, Dane, Doug, and Joe?
Yeah.
It does. It's conditioning.
Yeah, it's conditioning. So here's the other thing, Dane. When I first started talking about chemtrails, the leads that I followed led to, hemoglobin, red blood cells. It led to not only chemicals, barium, aluminum, cadmium, all the stuff they put into the chemtrail, what I call toxic soup of death, but it led to biological, organic matter also being incorporated. And then the question became, and there are plenty of studies, both Russian and U.S. studies, that the radio frequency can change the mutagenic capabilities or the mutagenic characteristics of pathogens. So the point being is that with that mutagenic nature, with the ability of those organic compounds, human blood cells, animal blood cells, and I would say this, and by alien, I don't necessarily mean from outer space, but unusual blood cells, the combined effect would be a binary weapon of unimaginable lethality. And so, Dane, in all your studies on geoengineeringwatch.org, how much of that, because obviously you've got the lines on Monsanto, we've got the glyphosate issues, we've got all the Roundup issues, you brought up Agent Orange. Was it surprising to you, or are you following that lead concurrently with not only just the death properties that we're expecting and experiencing an extinction level event, but also we're basically seeing an alteration of the human genome, are we not?
We are, and not just in the human organism. We're seeing, according to Norwegian researchers that I have communicated with fairly extensively, horizontal gene mutations occurring in all plant life. We are seeing these mutations in the environment. When you have nanoparticulates, bioavailable nanoparticulates, that with materials that we know are highly toxic to all organisms, the absorption of these particulates causes mutation, period. They're being absorbed in everything, period. This is an absolute fact. It's not disputable. So the bottom line on do I think that they are experimenting with electronically stimulated biotech, which is what you're referring to, I believe, that we could all be seeded with pathogens that would become virulent when exposed to the right frequencies? Do I think they're experimenting with that? Why wouldn't I think that? I'm with you on that completely. What I would suggest, however, is that the best laid plans of even a very advanced power structure have flaws and run aground. And if we look at, just like some of what you covered in your book, the Weather Wars and Unnatural Disasters, Steve, you have a chapter on the man-made earthquakes. Now, I want to use that as an example of power structure plans that go awry. For those who are skeptical, and I understand that skepticism, that seismic activity could be triggered by anything man-made, I would advise to look at the data. In regard to the Fukushima quake, 3 days prior to that quake, I was contacted by a person on the California coast who has a relative in military intelligence. She's in a tsunami zone. She was told by that relative to be out of that zone on Friday. She asked if I had heard anything. I hadn't. You hear certain things all the time. Again, this was the Tuesday before the quake, which happened on Friday. And when that quake happened that Friday morning, when she said that she was told to be away, you can imagine that I was certainly quite shocked. Now, to add corroboration to this, when we have organizations like MIT, very, very internationally recognized research institutes, and your listeners can search this, Steve and Joe and Doug, that MIT noted extremely anomalous atmospheric heating directly above the epicenter in the days prior to the quake. Unexplainable atmospheric heating. Now, this is absolutely what we would expect if ionosphere heaters were used to trigger seismic activity, and we know from all available data that they have this capability. However astounding it may sound to people, the data back this up, that in a seismically sensitive zone, if you beam that much power into the strata, and we're talking about many billions of watts, it causes vibrations, and that can cause seismic activity. So given all that we know about that quake, and given acknowledgement from MIT, and given the fact that Japan was starting to ally with its regional partners before that event, and certainly after that event did whatever the U.S. wanted them to do, there's a lot of data to back this up, and I'll add even more. General Bert Stubblebine, the highest-ranking U.S. Army general to speak out about 9/11, I've had considerable contact with him, done interviews with him, and General Stubblebine has stated that his associates still in the service have stated the quake was intended, but Fukushima was not intended. So when you trigger 9.0 quakes, bad things happen. And now we have Fukushima that may kill us all. So this is the haphazardness of the power structure. And back to the electronically stimulated biotech, Steve, I would argue, just like geoengineering, which sounds like it's some exact, precise science, it's not. And although they are experimenting with this, and I fully agree with you on that, I would argue their results will probably be very haphazard at best, and that's in our favor. Your thoughts?
Well, Yep, and let me share this because, again, I have a little different take on it, Dane, and not to be argumentative, but there are multiple generals and multiple what I would call top-level scientists in black physics that said that there was a neutron flux created in the reactor. People can look that up. Basically, it's you amass a massive amount of neutrons and you aim them, focus them, get them into the mass. There was literally, I don't know if you saw it, Dane, Doug, and Joe, but there was a video taken that showed and not just that this is not Project Bluebeam, but literally three or four shafts of intense energy going into the core. Did you see that, Dane?
Straight into Fukushima?
Yes. Let me share this, and I'll wet the whistle of everybody on this. Right now, more and more top secret aerial craft that the United States has reverse engineered. Probably the best example is TR-3, Tango Romeo 3 Bravos, the triangular shape that basically have three lights and they morph into a single light and seemingly vanish. From four-star generals, I've been told that we've had invisibility, not the stealth technology, but true invisibility for a long time. So I believe that was a generated earthquake, and I also believe that after the earthquake, they got by with a little help from their friends above. Their friends above is who has the most to gain? Well, the answer is the Illuminati. Who controls, or the global, population destroyers? Who has the most to gain? They do. So whether that's true and provable to the average mind, I believe that. Now let's jump to something, Dane, because the plankton are eating plastic. They're feasting on the ocean litter, and now they're claiming that the tiny plankton are ingesting fluorescent plastic debris. They're showing it on video, and it's changing their genetic structure. So whether Fukushima provides, and again, Dane, you've got a background in science, obviously working for Bechtel, formerly working for Bechtel. You don't get hired by Bechtel if you're a dummy. I know people that have worked there. The point, and that is not flattery, it's just a fact, okay? I think people who are listening to you tonight know that you know what you're talking about. Therefore, that changing the plankton and the entire field of nuclear physics has been rewritten by an idiot press with all of the lethal doses of radioisotopes being totally neglected, totally denied, and all of the mutagenic factors that are affecting the Japanese children, the Japanese produce, whether you're getting, strawberries from hell, not even looking to form strawberries, they're growing to different sizes. The question I have, and I guess I'd like your comment on it, is seeing that Fukushima and the mutagenesis taking place, the ionospheric heating taking place, especially in the Midwest of the United States, where we've had all the horrific tornadoes and the websites that actually monitor the HAARP signals. And for the record, I am not talking just about Gakona, Gakona, Alaska. I'm talking the 72 ionospheric heaters that are distributed throughout the world that seemingly can use satellites to focus their combined radio frequency wave energy. What are your thoughts on that? The fact that nuclear physics has been rewritten by idiots in the press and basically fed total manure, and what has happened is that the harvest has been totally false.
I don't argue with you on any of those points. In fact, even going back to Fukushima, I'm simply stating what I've been told, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I would subscribe to any particular conclusion on whether Fukushima was or wasn't. So, I don't think we're in opposition on that at all. Certainly, the scenarios you described are something we would expect the power structure to do, given the behavior we know that they exhibit. So, there's a lot of conclusions with Fukushima that are hard to come to solid determination on, but I think we are on the same sheet overall, Steve. It was certainly an event that appears to have the ionosphere heaters signature all over it. We have a lot of corroboration, again, even from organizations like MIT. And as far as the other experimentation that would go along with creating that type of nuclear cataclysm, that does fit into other things we see the power structure doing. So I don't think we're in opposition on that at all. I'm open to a lot of conclusions on that.
Oh, yeah, and I don't believe that we're on opposite pages at all. I just want people to hear your take on it because, again, you can't address one of the issues without all the issues. And remember this, even in the Communist Manifesto and even in the people that taught the current administration, their thought processes, it's to overwhelm the citizens with everything all at once. Well, let's take a break. And, Doug, do you want to take email questions for Dane? Is that okay, Dane?
Absolutely. Your questions are absolutely valid. Let me back up to the initial question. When people ask about or try to claim that we should expect aluminum in the soils, true, aluminum is a very abundant element, 8% of the Earth's crust. But this is what's most important. It does not exist in the environment in free form, period. It is always bonded to other elements. We have always, at Geoengineering Watch, always relied solely on precipitation tests for verification of what's raining down on us because this aluminum does not belong in the rain. The soil's pH changes in Shasta-Siskiyou County in the last 10 years from this high aluminum rain, which, by the way, the pH value of this rain is 10 to 12 times higher than it should be. Rain should be about 5.6, given the amount of atmospheric carbon we have. We're seeing 6.6, 6.8. This is from the aluminum in the rain, and our tests of samples from rain with pH that high verify the aluminum. So those that say we should expect this are simply lying. And we've seen soil pH changes, again, 10 to 12 times toward alkaline in the last 10 years. If this was normal, it would not have happened in the last 10 years. We've seen a decline in aquatic and terrestrial insect life in Northern California. Listeners should listen to this. 90% decline in aquatic and terrestrial insect life. 90%. U.S. Forest Service biologists that I work with attribute this primarily to the aluminum exposure in the case of the aquatic insect life. There's a lot of factors affecting terrestrial insects, including the UV. So let's progress on to the meteorologists. Quite simply, it's a very, very bad career decision to address this issue. It's that simple. We had word from a Fox meteorologist off the record. There was a connection that he was taken into a room and told, you do not mention this issue. I already mentioned to you what the university scientists have told me, that they were told, you simply don't address this issue. That's all there is to it. So we have a bunch of people trying to protect their paychecks and their pensions and their bubble of denial while the whole ship goes down. So it's that simple, Doug. It comes down to the fact this is a horrible career decision and people are simply afraid to speak out because they all know that anything they say or communicate is being monitored. And let's look at one last example, and I'll turn the mic back. Let's look at the man who spoke out about torture in the U.S., John Kiriakou. Who is the only one to go to prison for the torture? John Kiriakou. That's the society we live in, and everybody knows it.
Oh, okay. Well said.
Hey, Doug,
yeah.
I want, first of all, Dane, people are sending me emails, and a couple, Maggie and Bob said, where is the meeting going to be held, and at what time and what day? We've talked about everything, but we got to give that out. They said they can get a whole couple cars full of people to attend it. So I don't think you've said that. We'll give the actual, but where and when and at what time?
This is in Redding, California, which is Northern California. We'll post a flyer out permanently on geoengineeringwatch.org in the next day or two. Redding, California, Friday night, August 14th. Lots of places to stay in Redding. We're going to open the doors very, very early. We're going to have the doors open about 3 hours before the event actually starts so that people can communicate with some of the experts that will be there and not be rushed. And it'll be a very fast-moving and hard-hitting event. Statements of urgency from all these experts, a presentation by John Wells, and then my PowerPoint presentation, which will be the most hard-hitting I have ever given, and then we'll have a panel discussion afterwards. So all that will be in the flyer data. People can download the flyer and share it. It will be posted on geoengineeringwatch.org in the next 2 days.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Hey, Doug, I want to draw everybody's attention to something that's happening right now. It's related to what we're talking about on the peripheral, but I want people to be able to go to norsecorp.com, NORSE The cyber attacks right now that are coming in at St. Louis. Now, why is this important? It's critical for people to understand. The Greek banks are closed. China, trading was suspended. New York Stock Exchange, trading was halted. London, the subways were shut down. And in Paris, the subways were shut down. I believe it was United Airlines. It took them almost half the day to get their cyber attack happening, and the president made a point, and his cabinet members saying this was not a cyber attack. You can go on Norse Corp, NORSECORP.com, and watch it in real time. I'm watching it right now, not to take away from what Dana's talking about, but because I'm watching St. Louis get hammered. I don't know the attack type. It will tell you the attack types. It will show you where it's coming from. And the attack targets, you want to bet you already know them. U.S. is numero uno. So, ladies and gentlemen, when you think about this, I know that there's sensory overload, but what happened today was not an accident. It was payback. The Chinese are blaming the United States for their economic woes. And what you saw in the precious metals was somebody with huge money being able to just throw the metals to the dogs, buy paper metals, not physical. And I was told by one of the biggest suppliers in the world today, they've never seen so much silver being bought. Doug, what we're at, this isn't a plea, it's just telling everybody. I said on your show years ago, the day would come when you won't be able to buy it at any price. You can show the spot price at $15.25. It's not available at that price. So what do you have to pay? Whatever you have to pay, that's what it's available for. And so what's telling and compelling to me is this, is that orchestrated with that attack was some of the biggest purchases in the world by, guess who? J.P. Morgan, who owns 95% of the world's commodities contracts. Now, I'm not saying they're behind the attack. I'm just saying they took advantage of it. It's coming from China right now. It's increasing. So norsecorp.com. People be set, because on a weekend they're going to claim that there was a cyber attack that wiped out the U.S. banking, and all the money in all the accounts, I've warned about this for years, is going to be gone. So do as you feel led, as quick as you feel led. Go ahead, Doug, with questions.
Yeah, I just want to mention, Steve, that on HagmannandHagmann.com we have a direct link to Norse Corp, that site, as well as an alternative site as well that shows exactly what you're talking about in real time. So thank you for that. And yeah, it's just, Steve, technical glitches, right? All right. And I watched the media just explode with that drivel today, which just, it's insane. All right.
We'll go through these questions in the order we received them. First question is from Jim, and they have a question for you, Dane. Is there anything that the general population can do to lessen the effects or the chemtrail effects? They said they're heavy spraying in their area and would like to know if there's anything they can do on a day-to-day basis.
There absolutely is, and let me answer that in 1 second. I want to give one more final caveat to Doug's earlier question on the meteorologist. Another important fact to consider. All the weather modeling for the National Weather Service and NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is done by Raytheon, a primary weather modification contractor. So you have those doing the weather modification, supplying the weather modeling. Meteorologists are simply script readers. The entire flow of information is controlled from top to bottom. The FAA's weather modeling is done by Lockheed Martin, another primary weather modification player. So again, great links have been taken to control the entire weather disseminating mechanism, if you will. Bain Capital in Blackstone owns Weather Channel, Rothschild's Weather Central, Monsanto Climate Central, or Climate Corp, excuse me. So you have the climate modification cabal, the power structure controlling weather dissemination. So that's part of the question on the earlier question posed.
Gotcha.
On the lessening the effects, yes, everyone can chelate. Everyone should chelate daily. We have to try to keep these metals from building up in our system. I would recommend everyone go to their local nutritionalist and get on a very credible heavy metal chelation program. A lot of elements effective for this. The blue-green algae, chlorella, for example. Cilantro is good for freeing up heavy metals, but in conjunction with cilantro, an element like zeolite is helpful. A lot of water, calcium, minerals, elements your body needs so that it will not substitute these heavy metals in their stead. So there's a lot you can do to chelate to keep these metals flowing through your system and not lodging and building up. I would recommend everybody to see your local nutritionalist. A lot of those at health food stores that can assist you. This should be a primary concern for people to keep these metals moving through their system and not building up.
Dane, thank you for that. That's very important. I just want to say to Steve, going back to what Dane said prior to talking about the what can be done to avert or to mitigate the damages from the heavy metals. When Dane was talking about Raytheon and all of the powers that are involved in this, Steve, you and I got to talk about forming a posse. Okay, I just want to say that because seriously, man, this is absolutely incredible information. You've known this for years, but for us to hear this and for us to do nothing is unconscionable. Thank you, Steve. I just had to get that off my chest. All right, go ahead, Joe.
Another question with in regards to the chemtrails. A question here from Dr. Cindy. How long does it take for the particles to hit Earth?
That's a very important question. You'll hear internationally recognized geoengineers like David Keith from Harvard, who, again, I would encourage people to Google my name with his name. You'll see a 5-minute video of me confronting him at an international conference where he said this. When I confronted him after a 3.5-hour symposium of him talking about dumping 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates into the atmosphere annually, the question I asked him was, have you done any studies whatsoever on the toxicological effects on soils, waters, and the human organism? He tried to dodge the question by stating, more or less, there's a lot of particulates in the atmosphere, a little more won't hurt. When he was pinned down, he said this, we haven't studied this. Could terrible things happen tomorrow? We don't know. You can see that on film if you Google David Keith, Dane Wigington. As far as descent times go, a polymer chemist who just passed away 2 days ago that I have communicated with on this issue felt descent times could be as low as 12 to 24 hours. Back to David Keith, who is trying to sell to the world that these particles will remain aloft for years. That's an absolute lie. You can see them descending on the right day under the right conditions. It looks like a vertical veil falling to the ground. This stuff is raining down on all of us. It's absolutely beyond dispute. And if I could say one more thing to tie this in with everything Steve said. When Steve talked about all that's happening right now, and I'm completely with him on all that, the bottom line is we know what they're doing is absolutely accelerating the implosion of the biosphere by the day. When they can't hide this anymore, we have statistics of autism, for example, from MIT. 1 in 2 kids will have autism within 10 years. We're not going to get that far. But from every direction, again, we have biosphere implosion. That can't be hidden much longer. And all the things that Steve just described on the financial end are connected to climate engineering and the implosion it's causing, the impacts it's causing. Everything's connected. At the point in time they can't hide this, all hell's going to break loose all over the globe. So they are maneuvering their chess pieces into place right now. And this is what Jade Helm is all about, in my opinion. They are trying to maneuver their chess pieces in place as fast as they can before the public wakes up. We must beat them to that intersection. We must reach critical mass of awareness before the power structure has put all their chess pieces in place so that they are caught off guard and not us.
All right, you mentioned Jade Helm, Dane. The question, actually 2 questions here. I'll just summarize it. Jade Helm, with respect to what you're talking about, the geoengineering aspect of things, just tell us again what you believe Jade Helm would do relative to, in other words, geoengineering and Jade Helm, the relationship there, what's going on?
Again, I don't pretend to know exactly what will unfold with the Jade Helm military exercises, but when we see the progression of Posse Comitatus abandoned in the past, and now we have military exercises taking place within the U.S. lower 48, unprecedented events. all leading up to making a population accept seeing this military hardware and military personnel being moved into position, if you will. When we see the absolutely horrific weather events that Steve alluded to earlier, very correctly so, what can only be described as what his book describes, weather warfare. That's exactly what we're talking about. In Texas, the horrific flooding. In California, the absolutely unprecedented drought, heat conditions, both of which are a result of climate engineering, i.e. weather warfare. Is that not the softening up of certain populations to further the sort of destabilization and control that we've seen in so many countries, from sub-Saharan Africa to the Middle East? Every one of the Middle Eastern countries, every single one that was destabilized was subjected to horrific drought prior to that destabilization. Every one of them, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the list goes on. This is not an accident. We have global leaders on the floor of the UN, like the president of Iran and the VP of Iran, stating their country was being droughted out by NATO weather modification programs. So when we see the same thing happening in the U.S., why would we not come to the same conclusions? Our government is not there for our benefit. Any who believe this are living in an alternate reality. So when we see the same dots being connected here, why would we not come to the same conclusions?
Indeed. Thank you for restating that as you did initially. I appreciate that.
Another question here from Corey asks, could you please explain to the audience the role methane has in warming and how dangerous the warming of the Arctic is, especially the East Siberian Shelf?
East Siberian Shelf, okay.
But yeah, methane and the role methane has in warming.
That's an important question. Again, and back to the original structure of intentionally melting the Arctic and then a change of direction that with the power structure when they realized the magnitude of what they would unleash, and they've done it anyway. But methane over a 10-year time horizon is over 100 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. As methane enters the atmosphere, it's like covering the planet with a layer of glass. Heat comes in, doesn't get out. The planet right now, today, is warming at the rate of 4 Hiroshima bombs per second. The thermal energy of 4 Hiroshima bombs every second. That's how fast the heat is building up. And climate engineering is not mitigating that. It's making it far worse. How much methane is there in the Laptev Sea, in the East Siberian Shelf? Again, there's enough methane there mathematically to cause a Permian-style mass extinction 100 times over. There's enough to kill us all many times over. So if that release continues and climate engineering is worsening that situation, again, we will be at the end of the road. So the methane situation is hugely important. I encourage your listeners to search online Arctic methane emergency, and they must sift the baby from the bathwater. For example, the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, and I know some of that group, they have correct data as far as the severity of what's happening on the ground, but where they must be completely disregarded is when groups of scientists like the Arctic Methane Emergency Group call for geoengineering to be done. That's where we have to know that they are not telling the truth in that regard. So everyone must learn to sift the baby from the bathwater. But the fact that the methane emergency is happening, the data is too conclusive. It can't be ignored. It is happening, and it is an issue which will determine our common fate if it continues on this current course.
All right, very good. This from Oberlin, I believe I'm not sure first or last name, listening live from the UK right now, directed to both Dane and Steve. First, Dane, I'll just pose the same question to both of you. First to Dane. Left unchecked, what would you expect? If everything remained the same, the progress of things just keep going in terms of the geoengineering, what would you expect to have happen? In other words, would there be a single event, multiple events? Would there be some sort of what would happen? Left unchecked. What's the first bad or the next bad thing to happen if we do nothing?
First, or you Steve to go? Is that a question for me or for Steve, Doug?
Well, go ahead, Dane. You answer that first.
And hey, Dane, you're breaking up, so I don't know if it's the proximity to your Skype mic or whatever, but you're breaking up a little bit. So take your time and be clear.
I'll go slow. You know what it is? We have a massive thunderhead above us right now. It's breaking up my signal. So I'll try to speak as slowly and clearly as I can. At the moment in time, the power structure cannot hide the severity of what's unfolding, the magnitude of what they have done to global populations. Links will start dropping out of the chain, and that means they will start playing some of their cards. Some big shoes will drop. Environmentally, the biosphere is imploding. If nothing else changed the current trajectory as far as the condition of Earth's life support systems, we're heading mathematically to a planet that won't support life past 2040 based on the best frontline data, Northern Hemisphere much sooner. But that doesn't mean we go along fine till then. It's imploding right now, as I mentioned, global pelagic fish populations, the overall species extinction rate, so forth. So the bottom line is this. When links start falling out of the chain of the incredibly complex system that we are all a part of, that's when our reality will end. And I would argue, as Steve already mentioned, the financial goings-on today, when the card house, the illusion can no longer be maintained, that reality will go on its head. And I would argue that is very, very close. They can't hide this much longer. Steve.
Well, I would like to say, Doug, again, it's no longer the end is near, the end is here. And I think you can see it in the flooding that's taken place, especially because of listeners from Great Britain. I said this once, and I guess I got in a lot of trouble with certain people for saying this, but I've literally seen the British Isles almost totally underwater. Now, why would that happen? Because not only will the volcanism and the generated earthquakes using the same technology that Dana's talking about take place, but when the fountains of the deep open up with all the tectonic shifting, the thing I worry about too, Dane, is I've said this for 25 years on talk radio as a guest and as a host, that my biggest concern is, and I believe the entities will do this, is they'll generate an earthquake, whether the New Madrid on the west coast, east coast, Cumbre Vieja, all the things we've been told about, and that will shift and that will rupture the aquifers. Same thing in the British Isles. And so what I am telling people is this: you've got to understand that, and I don't agree with what's a single point, what I would call the major point. I think the major points are all happening. I think you take plankton, you take volcanism, you take earthquakes, you take the destruction of the ionosphere, you take on the mutagenic properties taking place by ionizing radiation. Anybody with a brain can look up the half-life of plutonium. It's not in weeks, days, it's in tens of thousands of years. The isotopes of some of the stuff being from Fukushima, the death in the ocean. And I'm going to tell you something. This is exactly what's playing out. Now, Dane, I got a question for you. We didn't address Morgellons. What have you found out? Because we've got a lot of people that listen to us that are suffering from Morgellons. Will you address that? Because concurrently with all of the other effects of geoengineering, Morgellons seems to have popped up and is devastating literally hundreds of thousands of lives. And remember, the doctors in the medical profession that's controlled said it's all psychosomatic. Will you address Morgellons, sir?
I think based on available data, it would be hard to argue that there isn't a connection between Morgellons and geoengineering. There absolutely is a connection. And for those in the medical community that deny this, again, we have blatant denial in academia to a degree that can barely be comprehended. From the climate science community that denies geoengineering is going on to the medical community that denies Morgellons as a reality, it's like we're living in some sort of B-horror movie that you can't wake up from, that those around you are unwilling to face or acknowledge the truth at any cost. And now they're so invested in the lie that they continue to perpetuate it. But again, Clifford Carnicom has done great work on the area of Morgellons. I would encourage people to investigate his work. And I think that his conclusions that there is absolutely a connection are valid. I think it's absolutely valid. And a lot of other issues. We know aluminum. I've been to Stanford with one of their top bioscientists there. Stanford has now connected aluminum with type 2 diabetes, obesity, we know ALS, autism, dementia, Alzheimer's. I mean, there's not much or perhaps nothing that these toxic metals don't do. And then the fibers that we know we have patents like the Welsbach patent that includes a polymer fiber. We're all absorbing those fibers. What happens when the body tries to expel those fibers? Is that connected to Morgellons? Perhaps. But again, Clifford Carnicom's work, I would say, in that arena, Steve, would be the most valid, and that's his areas of expertise. But I would say, in a conclusion, that it's absolutely certain that there's a connection between the exposure to the fallout and Morgellons.
And I'd like to address that too. Look, we're seeing plankton basically taking in polymers because that's what a plastic is. So the point being is that Morgellons and the body's natural defense system, the immune system, is trying to expel it. Unless you've talked to people who have suffered almost going to the point of insanity because they were told they were crazy and they got stuff coming out their skulls and other parts of their body, this is a real deal. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope everybody understands. By the way, I've got to make this clear. It's Norris Corp. I will spell it. Everybody thinks I'm saying Norris Corp. Okay? N-O-R-S as in Sierra, E as in Echo, Corp, C-O-R-P, short for corporation.com. N-O-R-S-E, like a Norseman, corp.com. I just had to do that. So getting back to Morgellons, I rest my case too, that now we've got sort of a strange thing happening with nanoparticles. Everything you read, everybody wants to put nanoparticles into your body. I believe that they literally want the Borg, Dane, and again, this is all going on at once. When you understand that the ultimate point of having all the money in the world or controlling all the money in the world is to basically control human lives. That's what's at stake, and I believe that it is a satanic, and I believe in Satan, and I don't believe in him, I acknowledge him. I believe that we're in the time where basically half the world's population is going to die, and people used to think we were crazy, Doug, talking about biblical prophecy when you take all these things together. For instance, David, God bless you, David, he's in South Dakota, and Dane, let's address the summer. He said, Steve, we've experienced summer. Let's address the hail this summer. We have experienced hail up to grapefruit size this summer, Spearfish, Belfourche, Newell, and surrounding areas. I sent the pictures from the local paper to the funnel clouds on our street. Some of the weather patterns that are on Dane Wigington's site, geoengineeringwatch.org, specifically talk about being able to generate hail of a disproportionate size. Will you address that? Because that's even, whether people accept or not, that's even a real weapon that's going to be used against the people on the planet. Let's face it, dodging a 100-pound hailstone at terminal velocity isn't anybody's idea of a good day.
Let's give an example for that, Steve. You're exactly on target with everything you just stated. In regard to chemical ice nucleation that then forms the nucleus for a building up of ice around that core, the ice balls in Lake Michigan, for Doug or Joe or you, Steve, I'm sure you've seen this in the last 3 to 4 years, massive ice balls are occurring in those lakes. Why? Because they're being chemically nucleated. The moisture over those lakes is being chemically nucleated, and that's the result. Same thing happens in a convective cell of rain. When they are ice nucleating, and they are, we can see this on the radar extremely clear. We can see areas of precipitation instantly flash out to frozen precipitation with no orographic enhancement. It means it's not moving over topography, over mountains. There's no colliding air mass of cold air. It simply flashes out the frozen precipitation. That can only happen when chemical ice nucleating agents are being dumped into that precipitation. And they're doing this right now, even with thunderheads, convective cells. What does that do? It starts the nucleation process much earlier at much higher temperatures. The hailstones become much larger. There you have it.
Interesting.
Another email question here from Karen. She asks, I have a question for your guest. I live in the highlands of Virginia, where the highest mountain in the state is 5,000 feet. My water comes from a mountain spring. Should I have my water tested, and what should I have it tested for in order to determine if these particles and heavy metals are present?
If you, and just to put a final cap on the ice nucleation, if your listeners have not seen the Lake Michigan ice balls, they should search that online. They'll find pictures that will shock them, and I think that will clarify the hail issue for them very clearly. It couldn't be more profound. On the testing of wells, these metals are highly reactive. They bond to other elements very readily. If that groundwater is very deep, that well may still be offering more or less pure water. Our wells in Northern California, where I live, the water is still mostly untainted because the water table is fairly deep. If the wells are shallow, they're likely quite contaminated with these elements. On the lab testing, you have to pick a lab that you hopefully feel is credible, because we have seen tests that were absolutely scrubbed. We had duplicate samples sent to 2 labs. One came back 0. One came back packed with aluminum. The lab that was zeroed out was near a Boeing factory. The lab owner knew why we were testing, and he simply sent back no results. Did not want to be in the middle of this controversy, and we're seeing that more and more. We're actually the lab owner for the new lab owner for the state-certified lab in Northern California. Old lab owner died an early, unexpected death. And I don't know if there's any connection, but I'm saying he's out of the picture. The new lab owner is telling people it's normal to have rain in your aluminum and in your air. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with people that are willing to say anything for a paycheck and a pension. So try to find a credible lab, but it's worth testing. If you have metal in it, it's worth filtering.
Hey, Doug, I want to add to what Dane just said. Anybody who's got a spring should have a cover on their spring, and they basically should draw the water from as close to the source. I remember in northern Michigan, Iron River, that's where Greg Evenson actually taught school in town. I was born in Stambo, Michigan. The bottom line is that, by the way, thank you, everyone, for praying for him. I don't have any more current update than the one I already posted, but I want to say a special thank you. Greg Evenson is probably one of the bravest men who has told people the true level of the battle that's coming against them, not in the realm that Dane and I are talking about, but in the literal repositioning of military assets, and told you years ago how this is going to play out. Greg is a decorated Green Beret. He doesn't talk, he doesn't brag, but he's also probably one of the bravest men I know, and he sent me an email the night before he went surgery, and I think I'll post it just to let people know this is not grandstanding, saying goodbye to me and thanking me for being a friend. I immediately put up the alert, and the people of God all over the world went to prayer for him. So people, whether they believe in God, that's irrelevant. The thing that's relevant is the people that do believe in God would touch God for Greg Evenson, and he's still alive by the grace of God. Also, Kent Hovind was released from 10 years in prison for something he should never have been in prison for in the first place. You remember, we called the world to prayer on Hagman and Hagman for him. Others went to prayer, others went, Dave Daubermeyer and others took up the cause, God bless Dave, but the point being is these are miraculous things taking place in the worst of times. I also want to say this to people that think your gardens growing organic vegetables are safe. You must all go to greenhouses. You must go to what I call drip troughs, where the water running off, even the rainwater, is taken away and run downhill or pumped downhill away from there's no such thing, by the way, as organic vegetables, because with the chemtrail spraying, and this is something, Dane, that I've been told by guys who basically have got to stay hidden or they'll die, okay? People just don't get the severity of what's going on. When you've got 5 natural health doctors being murdered, one of them, the one that was shot in the chest that they claimed shot himself in the chest, I talked to the builder of his house, and a guy who was personal friends with him, and said he did not commit suicide at all. His whole point was on vaccination and mercury in it. So when we openly see people being killed, whether they're the one that Dane just mentioned, or there's now up to 5 natural doctors and they're outspoken critics of vaccine, when you understand who controls all the dissemination of information, whether it's the Rothschild-owned Weather Channel, all the things that Dane ran through, the point is, ladies and gentlemen, you've got to be proactive. Those of you who are gardeners, gardeners, you must build greenhouses. You have to do that. Those of you that raise cattle, obviously everybody knows that they should be eating grass-fed, grass-finished beef if possible. Same thing with, free-range chicken. Same thing with organic pork. All of these things. But everybody smugly says, well, I'm buying organic stuff. There is no such thing at this point as you have known it. Whole Foods sold out and basically now is not even going to carry organic. They're making the claim that GMO stuff is just as good, if not better. So, Dane, do you want to address that? Because I deal, and having been one of the guys, I don't know if you know this, but starting the prep movement 35 years ago, I think, the point being is that there's so many misconceptions, and this touches everything. This touches everyone. I'm talking about geoengineering and the fallout. Would you comment on that? Because, again, you like to think you're eating safe food, safe meat. For those of you that eat meat, even the vegans and vegetarians will be surprised at how much they want to kill everyone. Will you deal with the food issue?
Everything you said, every point you made is exactly on target. There's no organic anything at this point. In regard to the grass-fed beef, same Norwegian researchers I communicated with have calculated how much aluminum a grass-fed cow would consume in a year there in Norway. And it's a little over a half a kilo. Think about that. That's how much aluminum a cow would ingest in a year from the amount of aluminum the grass is absorbing. There is no organic anything at this point. And this is where the reluctance of the organic growers, communities, environmentalists, for them to face this issue has been extremely perplexing for me. They want to focus on little corners of comfort zone, if you will, and they're not facing this issue. And I hope that changes. And for a lot of them, and I've spoken to the head of Sierra Club, I've debated on national radio with Greenpeace's top scientists who pretended not to know this is going on. They're all trying to protect their 501c3 nonprofits, and that's not going to matter much longer when we're all looking for our next bite of food on a planet that no longer supports life. So the bottom line is, with a lot of the spiritual institutions, unfortunately, the same factors involved. They're protecting their 501c3s. They won't address this issue. Congregations in those institutions must force their leaders to face this issue. This is required of us. This is scriptural as well, right? We're required to be good stewards, period. We're required to try to protect our children. It's not an option, it's an obligation. So on the foods, you're exactly right, Steve. There is nothing that's not contaminated at this point. Back to climate engineering, back to the inarguable facts. For those, whatever other complexities people struggle with comprehending or believing, here's the inarguable facts. There's a mountain of toxic heavy metal raining down on all of us. The lab tests prove it. We're breathing it. It's being absorbed in everything. That's an indisputable fact, period. Yours, Steve. We're done.
Go ahead, Doug. More questions,
yeah. Joe? Quick question here. The Southern Hemisphere versus the Northern Hemisphere. Is there any distinction, difference? Is one hemisphere safer than the other, or are we just getting slammed? I mean, we understand this is globally, but listener wants to know if there's a difference in hemispheres.
Yes. Mathematically speaking, the trajectory for the Southern Hemisphere is better than the Northern Hemisphere. On the current course, survivability in the Southern Hemisphere might be a decade longer, but that's still not much. We have more methane in the Northern Hemisphere. We have a more concerted effort to keep the ice pack intact in the Southern Hemisphere and Antarctica. We have less methane release, and we have a lot less nuclear plants. There's only, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's where they're all centered. So there's a number of factors that make the Northern Hemisphere less survivable, but we're slicing hairs at that point. If we're talking about perhaps 10 more years, if under the right circumstances, I don't know that it's going to make much difference.
Understood. Yeah, there was an issue there, Steve, with somebody asking about.
Yeah, I answered an email, and basically, in my early ages of survival preparedness, I studied nuclear fallout patterns. Now, obviously, there wasn't the geoengineering going on, but it seems like the areas, Dane, that the elite have reserved for themselves are less subjected, even by satellite, to geoengineering. I'll give you a good example. The dynasty of the Bushes have pretty much settled for Uruguay, which sits on the largest, I guess, underground water aquifer in South America, or one of them. When Neville Shute wrote his book On the Beach in 1959, many of you remember that. My favorite scene, I guess we could have that. I think the guy's in his Ferrari in his garage and he asphyxiates himself as the end of the world. Well, I don't tend to want to tell anybody to do that, and I wouldn't do it myself. But the point being is the southern hemisphere, even the elite in their underground bases in Australia, in New Zealand, in the secret undersea bases, and believe it or not, they exist. Everything that I have studied up until the point I can't tell you is that the elite have pretty much preserved the southern hemisphere for themselves. When I was talking to certain generals who basically said, you would be wise, Steve, and these are 4-stars, to relocate to the southern hemisphere, they reiterated that point. So I'm not arguing with you. I'm just telling you what I know to attenuate what you just said.
You're exactly right. I mean, there's no question. And on the Bush's purchase of land in South America, I'm familiar with those facts and completely with you. That's exactly what they've done. It's certainly a better place to be. There's no arguing that. I'm just making the point that for the long term, given the inertia behind what's happening, if we don't change course, starting with the stopping of climate engineering, the time frames are quite narrow. Again, mathematically right now, what it calculates out to is no life left in the northern hemisphere about 2030, southern hemisphere about 2040. That's if unexpected elements don't injure the equation. So, yeah, absolutely a better place to be, but ultimately we're heading for Venus syndrome on this track. That's a scientific scenario that your listeners should perhaps Google, and they'll understand the factors that affect that scenario. Once you trigger certain mechanisms on the planet, they feed themselves until we have a planet that ends up like Venus. And for the record, many people think Venus is 900 degrees on the ground because it's so close to the sun. That's not the case. Venus would be about 20 to 25 degrees warmer, all things being equal. It underwent a runaway greenhouse effect. So that's the trajectory we're on. And back to the southern hemisphere, yes, better, but only for a while.
All right. I've got a listener here with a question about roughly, if you know this or could give some sort of estimation as to how many people, individuals, are actually flying the aircraft that are giving us the visual indications in the sky, meaning the chemtrails. You know, is it 100? Is it 1,000? Is it 10,000? And what agencies are they associated with?
We can't know on the piloting of the aircraft. Could some of them be drones? Yes. So we can't answer that question. I spoke to a KC-135 pilot face-to-face. Didn't know what he was doing up there, was being told to fly from point A to point B. When he went back to ask questions, the last news I got from him was medicated behind a desk. So he was flying an aircraft, certainly. So we can't know how many are drones. As far as agencies involved, again, it's not just the Air Force. The Navy appears to be involved as well. Bottom line, it's Department of Defense. And we have private carriers involved. Again, I'm not implicating the private carrier personnel or pilots because these are automated systems. But the fact that their aircraft are involved cannot be disputed. We can track them from the ground with Flight Tracker. We have photographs, which, again, I'll publish on a video in a few days. We already have some on our website of the retrofit nozzles on their aircraft. We have film footage of them spraying. There's no question about that. So there's a lot of people involved directly or indirectly. I personally spoke face-to-face with a top executive from Jeppesen, which is a subsidiary of Boeing. Jeppesen coordinates all global flights. After 15 minutes of conversation, when I mentioned the word geoengineering, he literally turned his back and walked away. Not another word was said. Whole lot of people participating and seemingly without conscience. But we have to bring this issue to light, Doug and Joe and Steve. I mean, I know you all realize the gravity of this issue, and I focused on this issue for this reason. If we could get this issue to light and global populations realized the extent to which they had been experimented on, the extent to which they have been harmed, their children have been irreparably harmed, Their health has been irreparably harmed, their environment irreparably harmed. If we could get this issue to light, it would cause a shockwave around the globe like no other. And the power structure will try to hide this to the last moments, but this is the issue that could break the dam and drag everything out with it.
We must.
Interesting. Got a question here from James, and he asks about, is there any way class action lawsuits could be filed to stop this geoengineering program? He goes on to say there certainly is enough evidence to present to the justice system and all the EPA clean air and water standards that are on record are being violated. Is there any way to bring a class action lawsuit, or do you think it would even be fruitful?
There is a way. It is being discussed. Those wheels are turning. I'm involved with the attorney team. I'm on the conference calls with them. We have one of the CEOs of one of the top environmental consulting firms in the entire world, a firm with 10,000 employees. He is on our calls with us. This is being discussed. And the point with such a class action suit is this. This is national security. Climate engineering is considered national security. They will defend it as much as they can and hide it as much as they can. But if suit is filed and it's being worked on now diligently, it will bring the media attention that we so desperately need. And I would argue again, once we reach critical mass, once those in the military realize what they're a part of, that's the point in time when we have a real chance of exposing and stopping this. Just the exposure alone, regardless of the results of the suit, the credible filing of such a suit, and the media bounce from that, is the exposure we would need to put a crack in the dam. And that's all we have to do is put a crack in it. Once there's a crack in it, there'll be no stopping the flow.
Understood. Steve, we only have about 6 minutes left. Your closing thoughts? How do you want to do this?
Well, number one, I think the meeting that Dane's going to be having in Redding, California on August 14th is a must-go-to for people who have been activists. When I say activists, I'm talking about who care for their fellow human beings. I believe we are the salt of the earth as Christians. Jesus said the salt lost its savor. It's henceforth good for nothing but to be trodden underfoot. Same thing with a city that's hit on a hill. You don't put your light under a bushel. I never believe that a 501c3 church be holding to the state. Their battle cry should be onward, Christian soldier, meaning it's a war. Instead, it's turned into the meow mix anthem and the roosters cluck, cluck, clucking, In other words, you don't get eggs out of a non-producing chicken coop, but you seem to get nothing out of the chicken coops that are passing themselves off as pulpits, and I'm serious about that. It is incredible that people don't get that. I want to share something. I believe it is imperative that people go through, take the time. If you go through one patent every 10 minutes a day, get that information. If somebody says, I don't believe in chemtrails, that's all a crazy conspiracy. You're a doom monger. You're a fear porn purveyor. Just start quoting the numbers. You can at least learn 2 or 3 of the numbers and say, okay, then why was this patent issued in 1939? Why was this patent issued in 1986? And ladies and gentlemen, I would encourage you, I took this thing on. People have called me crazy so long that I think that maybe they'll find out that crazy is just another word for someone who saw something they didn't. I know that Dane's taken a lot of flack. I know the danger. I know he's put everything he believes in, everything he owns on the line. And so I would encourage you, seriously, get my book Weather Wars, because when you think that was written 15 years ago, you'll understand that I believe God is showing you the attack. By the way, there's a scripture, and I take heart in this, and I believe it applies to the most wicked entities on the planet. God says, I will destroy those who destroy the earth. This isn't just an earthly battle. I believe, Dane, just so you know, I believe in people have got to be totally proactive, totally informed, and I believe if they don't stand up now, they will be put down in not too near a future. Meaning that it's a matter of life and death. See, that, Doug, is what I feel has absolutely been lost with all the information that's out there. I told Dane, I think, on the phone, and if I didn't, I told somebody on the phone today, I forget who it was, but I said, when you go on the radio, when I go on the radio, we have to say what we would say if it's the very last thing we ever did. And I think Dane just said that, and I'm going to turn it right back over to him. And Dane, thank you for coming on. I think this is one of the most important shows in the history of me either being a guest, Doug, thank you, and Joe, or being a moderator or being a talk show host, whatever, okay? I think this is one of the singular most important shows as to what is the danger that is upon us all. And again, it isn't just the weather. It is earthquakes. It is famine. It is all related to this. I believe this is a central plan. That's why I believe so much money and so much effort has been put into it. And ladies and gentlemen, you are what you eat. You are what you drink. You are what you think. Again, my book, Weather Wars and Unnatural Disasters, I got enough footnotes in there to make a woman's shoe store happy. So please take advantage of Dane's site. I love the patents, Dane. It saves me looking it up. Go ahead, sir. Finish out your portion.
Everything you stated, Steve, I'm certainly in full agreement. I didn't want to spend the last 12 years of my life completely engaged in this battle 80 hours a week. Bottom line is this. It is indisputable these materials are raining down on us, indisputable that we are absorbing them. If we don't face this, none of us will be cognitively functional enough to face any challenge very, very soon. 1 in 3 seniors in the U.S. dies with Alzheimer's and/or dementia now. We're all absorbing this. So the bottom line is, yes, we face a lot of other challenges, but this one is the one that will most determine our outcome. If we can't think clearly, if we keep absorbing these metals and we keep becoming more and more sick and less cognitively functional, game over, along with the planet's life support system. So that's why I'm focused on this. I hope everybody will help us get involved. Share the word on geoengineeringwatch.org. On the upper left, there's activist suggestions, flaming arrow link, ways that people can, from their own home computer, help us in this battle. My gratitude to you, Steve. I can't express how much gratitude to you and to Doug and to Joe for helping to give this issue a voice. Thank you.
Dane, thank you so very much for coming on. Geoengineeringwatch.org is his website, linked directly off of HagmanandHagman.com, SteveQuayle.com as well. Steve, my brother, thank you for superintending this interview. Your questions were right on and something that we could not have done really without you. So thank you so much for that, brother.
You're welcome, Doug. God bless everyone, and keep Greg Evans in your prayers. Bye-bye.